Imagine closing your eyes and finding yourself on a staircase that descends into the earth. Each step is cool, echoing, endless. You smell stone, old stone, damp and listening. At the bottom glows a chamber. On a golden throne sits something made of flesh, vast and silent, its eyes neither human nor divine. You feel your mother's voice somewhere behind you whisper, "The man-eater," and you understand nothing, only that this dream will not end when you wake. That vision belonged to a small Swiss boy named Carl Jung. He would spend the rest of his life trying to understand what waited at the bottom of that staircase. While other children learned arithmetic and hymns, he was already mapping the corridors beneath the human mind. The soil that formed him Switzerland, 1875. A landlocked garden of mountains, neat villages, and invisible depths. 4 centuries without foreign war had turned the nation inward. Where other countries measured glory by conquest, the Swiss measured it by conscience. They argued in town squares, voted in church halls, mistrusted kings, and obeyed the weather. Here Jung was born, July 26th in Keswil by the Rhine, among vineyards, ruined Roman walls, and Protestant restraint. The Swiss character seeped into him like mineral water through stone, practical on the surface, volcanic underneath. His father, Paul Jung, was a pastor who preached God's grace with eyes that never quite believed. His mother, Emily Preisberg Jung, was half in this world, half out. She kept 2 personalities, one for daylight, another for the night, when voices whispered through the parsonage. Carl watched them both and learned the first truth of his later psychology, that every soul carries more than one face. A child of 2 worlds. By the age of 4, he already felt divided. Personality? Number 1, the timid schoolboy who stumbled through Latin declensions and hid from older boys. Personality number 2, the ancient witness who felt older than his parents, who could remember centuries he had never lived. He would sit beneath chestnut trees, staring at stones until they seemed to breathe. He wondered whether the stone thought of him the way he thought of it. To adults he seemed dreamy, slow, perhaps a little odd. Inside, he was already negotiating treaties between heaven and hell. When he imagined God, it wasn't the gentle figure his father described. It was a vast power capable of both creation and ruin, and one day that truth would crash through him like thunder. The vision of the cathedral. One afternoon in Basel, sunlight poured through the stained glass of the great cathedral. Young Carl stood outside, fighting a thought he dared not think. For days it stalked him, a blasphemy waiting to be born. When he could resist no longer, the image came, God himself seated above the cathedral, releasing an enormous excrement that shattered his own church. Instead of terror, Jung felt ecstasy. He knew without language that the divine refused to be tamed by human architecture. Creation and destruction were one act. It was his first encounter with what he would later call the shadow, the truth that light demands darkness to exist. Loneliness as teacher. No one could hear such visions. His father's faith had withered into sermons. His mother's mysticism frightened him. So he kept silent. Isolation became his classroom. While other children learned multiplication tables, Jung learned how silence bends around a secret. At night he lay awake listening to the old house breathe. Sometimes he sensed presences, ancient, patient, neither good nor evil. He was not yet a psychologist. He was a medium of wonder and dread. The experience planted his lifelong conviction that the psyche was not contained in the skull, but spread through the world like weather. Dream language. His earliest dreams arrived in images rather than words. Serpents, subterranean thrones, celestial feces. He began to suspect that the unconscious spoke in symbols, the same way myths spoke to nations. Much later he would say that every dream is a private myth, and every myth is a public dream. At 11, he realized that the mind is a living landscape, not a ledger to be balanced. Yet that realization came with cost. Teachers called him lazy, scatterbrained. He failed mathematics, stared through windows, drifted between personalities. The other boys boxed him in their games. He withdrew further, saving his energy for inner battles no one saw. The split becomes conscious. One day during class, a sudden dizziness overtook him. He fell, striking the ground. Lying there, he heard a thought. Now you won't have to go to school. The thought felt delicious. Soon fainting became a habit, a physical rebellion against the external world. Doctors found nothing wrong. For 6 months he collapsed whenever school approached. Then he overheard his father confide to a friend, "We have no money if the boy never works." The word stabbed deeper than any diagnosis. That night he opened his Latin grammar again, felt the old vertigo surge, and fought it. For an hour he trembled, sweat-soaked, until the darkness receded. He never fainted again. It was his first experiment in the science of the soul, proving that will could command symptom, that the mind could create and cure its own illness. Decades later, he would recognize it as the birth of his method, the conscious encounter with the unconscious. The Swiss mirror. Switzerland was both cradle and metaphor. Its mountains were not barriers but mirrors, reflecting inner heights and depths. Its democracy, built on self-examination, echoed his psychology of individuation. Where other nations blamed enemies, the Swiss turned inward, and so would Jung. The Rhine outside his childhood home became his private Jordan River. He walked its banks alone, watching the current swirl around stones older than I. Christianity, thinking that time itself was circular, not linear. He once wrote that the Swiss spirit was peasant soil with a philosopher's root. That soil anchored him when his own mind later threatened to unroot itself entirely. He would march in the Swiss militia, chop his own wood, build his own towers, not out of patriotism, but as ritual grounding. When his visions flooded, he returned to physical labor the way a sailor grips a mast in storm. Seeds of the unconscious. The boy who dreamt of subterranean gods also read voraciously. Goethe's Faust, Schopenhauer's Gloom, Kant's cold architecture of reason. Each author hinted that reason alone could not contain the abyss. By adolescence, he suspected that philosophy was merely psychology in disguise, men arguing about their own souls through abstract terms. He began keeping notebooks of strange words that floated into his mind, trying to see if they formed patterns. They did. He noticed that certain words carried emotion, others none. A priest once asked him about faith, and Jung's answer came out detached. Later, writing the word faith, his pulse quickened. Something inside responded. He didn't yet call it a complex, but he was already measuring invisible strings that pulled thought and feeling together. The first ritual. At 15 he found a smooth black stone on the riverbank. It fit his palm perfectly. On an impulse he carved initials on it, not his own, but those of a small man who lived inside him, ancient and nameless. He would talk to the stone when no one watched. It became a confidant, a focus for conversation between the two halves of himself. Years later, he realized he had invented his first ritual of active imagination, the art of speaking with symbols until they speak back. Faith lost, faith reborn. When the time came for his confirmation, Jung expected revelation. The church smelled of wax and boredom. He tasted the wafer and felt nothing. God, who once shattered cathedrals in his dreams, now seemed absent behind liturgy. That emptiness was unbearable, yet fertile. The whole faith left became the womb of psychology. He would later say that modern man's neurosis comes from having gods who no longer speak. His life's mission would be to give those gods a language again. The quiet river evenings on the Rhine, the young Jung would sit watching reflections of clouds drift on the water's skin. He imagined two realities flowing together, the visible and the invisible, consciousness and its shadow. Sometimes he threw pebbles and watched circles expand until they overlapped and disappeared. That image of ripples merging stayed with him, every act of mind creating waves that touch other minds, every thought altering the whole. He didn't know it yet, but he was inventing depth psychology under a child's sky. The promise of descent. Behind the calm Swiss surface, volcanoes stirred. He would soon leave the vineyards for lecture halls, trade family prayers for laboratory notes, dissect corpses while dreaming of gods. He would meet Freud, worship him, defy him, descend into madness, and return with a map for all of us. But in this first chapter, before the fame, before the visions, There was only a boy in a stone house beside a river, learning the first rule of the psyche, that light begins in darkness, and every awakening is preceded by a dream. The two selves. A child lives two lives, one the world can see, the tidy surface of family, school, small rebellions, and another that moves beneath, unseen, whispering truths that adults forget. Carl Jung grew up between those two lives until the tension nearly broke him. He later called them personality number one and personality number two, the citizen and the sage, the obedient son and the ancient witness. Every person he believed carries this split, but few are forced to face it so early or so alone. The ordinary boy. Personality. Number one wore wool trousers and ink on his fingers. He attended school in Basel, memorized Latin verbs, tried to keep pace with boys who cared about games more than thoughts. He blushed easily, hated arithmetic, and dreaded the way teachers' voices echoed like verdicts. He wanted to belong. He wanted to believe that the outer world was enough. When he laughed with classmates, he almost succeeded, but then the bell would ring, the crowd would scatter, and silence would fall like a curtain. Inside that silence waited the other one, personality number two, watching, patient, immense. The ancient companion, personality number two, spoke not in words but in sensations, the weight of centuries pressing on his shoulders, the certainty that he had lived before. Perhaps as a monk copying manuscripts by candlelight, perhaps as a Roman watching empires fade. When the schoolboy looked at cathedrals, he felt not awe but recognition. He had built them. He had prayed inside their stone lungs long before this century. This inner presence was serene, grave, beyond argument. It carried memories that were not his yet belonged to him. In later years, he would call it the timeless man within. At the time, it simply made him lonely. The house of two rooms. He imagined his mind as a house divided. Upstairs, the daylight rooms where homework and small talk lived. Downstairs, a chamber lined with books that did not yet exist, their titles glowing faintly in the dark. When he descended, the air grew still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Sometimes he felt the two selves change places, the ancient one coming upstairs, the schoolboy shrinking into silence. He feared discovery, as though someone might open the wrong door and find both living there. Early wounds. The split deepened through small humiliations. Once a teacher accused him of cheating on a geometry problem. He hadn't, but he couldn't explain how the answer had simply appeared in his mind like an echo from elsewhere. The injustice burned deeper than the accusation itself. He realized that knowledge could arrive unbidden, and that frightened people. Another time, a classmate shoved him on the playground. His head struck stone. The world went black. When he awoke, he heard a thought, not his voice, but the calm voice of the other. You need not return to that place if you choose not to. Soon after, the fainting spells began. The language of the body. For months he collapsed whenever school approached. Physicians found nothing. Priests advised prayer. Only he understood the fainting as a negotiation between his two selves. The body was obeying the spirit's refusal. Personality number two would not waste its strength on rote learning and childish quarrels. The boy's muscles carried the rebellion. His lips could not speak. But overhearing his father's despair, "We have no money if he cannot work," changed everything. Love called him back to the world. He returned to his desk, opened the Latin grammar, and battled the darkness rising behind his eyes. When he conquered it, he felt a triumph larger than passing any exam. He had learned that the psyche could command the body, and that will, when allied with meaning, was medicine. A secret religion. Around this time, he began inventing a private ritual. He gathered smooth stones from the riverbank and arranged them in patterns. Each stone represented a thought, a memory, a dream. He greeted them silently before bed, as if they were priests of an older faith. To anyone else it looked like a child's play. To Jung it was worship, not of idols, but of images rising from within. The world above might dismiss imagination as fantasy. Below it was revelation. Dream teachers. Dreams became nightly classrooms. One returned again and again, descending steps into the earth, the giant on the throne. Another showed a radiant tree whose roots reached down instead of up. He woke knowing that wisdom grows from darkness, not light. He told no one. To share such images would invite laughter or pity. Better to be a silent initiate than a misunderstood prophet. School and solitude. By adolescence, he lived like two people sharing one skin. In class, he copied notes, outwardly attentive. Inside, he held dialogues with invisible companions. At recess, he watched other boys fight and thought of ancient wars. When teachers scolded him, he felt pity, not for himself, but for their blindness. It was an unbearable superiority for a child to feel. He longed to trade it for ignorance, but the exchange was impossible. Loneliness pressed on him until it became a kind of clairvoyance. He could sense moods before people spoke, and see the hidden fear behind authority. This sensitivity would later become empathy, the cornerstone of his therapy, but in youth it was a curse. The pastor's son. At home the tension grew heavier. His father's sermons rang hollow. Carl could see doubt quivering behind each word. After church, he watched parishioners shake the pastor's hand, unaware that the man blessing them no longer believed. That quiet tragedy etched itself into the boy's memory, the side of faith pretending to be whole. From it he learned that repression kills spirit faster than heresy. He vowed never to silence his own experience, even if it looked like madness. His mother drifted between laughter and trance. Sometimes she spoke in another tone, as if someone else borrowed her voice. She frightened him, yet confirmed what he already suspected, that consciousness was only a small island in a vast psychic sea. The collapse of faith. When his confirmation arrived, he approached the altar expecting revelation. Incense, candles, Latin murmurs, but no presence. The wafer dissolved tastelessly. Heaven remained silent. He sat in the pew thinking, "This is all dead." That emptiness cracked him open more completely than any sermon could have. The church's silence forced him to find the divine elsewhere, in dream, in nature, in the secret dialogues of the heart. The hidden scholar. Deprived of external faith, he turned inward to books. Goethe's Faust, with its pact between man and devil, felt autobiographical. He read Schopenhauer's Gloom and felt understood, the will as cosmic suffering. Kant's dry logic fascinated yet repelled him. A cathedral built entirely of thought with no altar for the soul. Each philosopher seemed to describe a fragment of his own division. He realized philosophy was psychology in disguise, systems of reasoning erected around private wounds. He began to keep notebooks of words that carried emotional charge. He would write a word, wait, notice the feeling it awakened. Some words rang empty, others pulsed with power. He did not yet call this association experiment, but he was already tracing the pathways between language and the unconscious that would later revolutionize psychiatry. The mask of normality. To survive, he cultivated a mask. He learned to mimic interest in the ordinary, weather, politics, school gossip. The performance cost energy, but it protected the sacred interior. He called it later the persona, the face we wear for society. Beneath it, personality number 2 watched everything like a hidden witness, noting how easily humans forgot themselves in imitation. He wondered if adults ever realized they were acting. Did anyone live from the center anymore? These questions hardened into destiny. He would make it his life's work to reunite the mask and the soul, the conscious and the buried. The stone confidant. He kept the Black River stone long after childhood. When anxiety struck, he held it in his palm until warmth passed between them. He carved strange symbols onto it, circles, crosses, serpents biting their tails. Later he recognized them in medieval alchemical texts and realized the unconscious had been speaking through him in the universal language of symbols. That realization thrilled and frightened him. If the psyche could create symbols unknown to consciousness, then the mind was not a single self but a community. He was already living among his future discoveries. archetypes, complexes, collective memory, all contained within the boy and his stone. The invisible friend. Sometimes at dusk he felt another presence beside him, not threatening, but immense. It asked nothing, offered nothing, merely existed. He sensed it as both companion and mirror. When fear or doubt overtook him, he would walk to the riverbank and feel that presence return, like a tide. He couldn't name it then, but later he would call it the self, the totality that contains all opposites, the hidden pattern guiding each life, the gift of solitude. Isolation refined him. Deprived of easy friendship, he learned to converse inwardly. His imagination became a laboratory and temple. In silence, he could hear nuances others missed, the texture of thought, the heartbeat of symbols. What tormented him as loneliness became preparation for listening to other souls. He would one day sit across from patients and recognize in their stories echoes of his own double life. He once wrote, "The greatest privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The boy in Basel was already apprenticed to that task. The dream of the number two. Near the end of adolescence, he dreamed he stood on a high cliff overlooking two rivers merging. One ran clear, one dark. As they joined, whirlpools formed, violent and beautiful. From the depths rose two figures, identical faces, opposite expressions, and they merged into one body of light and shadow. He woke up trembling, understanding nothing but feeling everything. Years later, he would see in that dream the essence of individuation, the union of conscious and unconscious, reason and instinct, saint and sinner. At the time, it only confirmed that he was living two lives destined to collide. A moment of clarity. One winter afternoon he sat alone after class, sunlight slanting across the empty desks. Dust floated like galaxies in a beam of gold. He realized suddenly that the room, the sunlight, the entire visible world existed only because consciousness perceived it. The observer was not separate from the observed. A thrill passed through him, the intuition that reality itself was psychological. The cosmos was mirrored inside the mind. It was the first glimpse of a truth that would later shape all his writings. Psyche and world are two sides of the same coin. The bridge between selves. By his late teens, Jung began negotiating peace between the two personalities. He no longer tried to destroy one for the other. Instead, he imagined them as partners, the boy who learns to live in time, and the timeless one who teaches meaning. Sometimes he felt them sit together in silence, like old friends who no longer need words. When harmony held, he sensed a third presence rising, not a compromise but a synthesis. It felt like sunlight filtered through deep water, calm, complete, alive. He would spend the rest of his life helping others find that same middle space. Prelude to a calling. When he entered university, still uncertain of his path, the split guided his choice. Medicine would satisfy personality. Number one, the rational, respectable vocation. But psychiatry, the borderland between science and soul, would belong to personality number two. He didn't yet know that this marriage of opposites would define modern psychology. He only felt dimly that healing others might one day heal the fracture within himself. Closing reflection. If you look closely, you'll see that Jung's entire psychology was born before his first lecture. Theories of shadow, persona, complex, and self were not invented in laboratories. They were lived in a child's room in Switzerland. He was his own first patient, his own case study in the mystery of being two. The boy who fainted to escape the world learned to return willingly. The ancient within learned compassion for the modern. Between them they forged the man who would teach generations that wholeness is not perfection, but dialogue. In each of us there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us. Carl Jung, The Call to Madness. There are moments when the soul knocks from the inside. At first the sound is gentle, an unease behind the eyes, a dream that lingers too long. Ignore it, and the knocking grows louder until the door splinters. For Carl Jung, the door began to crack in his early 20s. The world called it sickness. He would later call it initiation. The return of the spell. He had conquered the fainting fits once through sheer will. But mastery is never final. The unconscious waits. During his first semesters at Basel University, long nights of dissection and the smell of ether reopened the wound. He could feel vertigo coiling in the muscles of his neck like an old serpent. One evening in the anatomy hall, surrounded by cadavers, a whisper rose in his mind. All these bodies were once dreaming. The thought froze him. The stillness of the dead seemed contagious. He felt his pulse slow, the room sway, and the familiar blackness reach for him. He gripped the metal table and fought back. The faint passed, but a deeper dizziness remained. The realization that life and death were not opposites but neighbors. The outsider among scholars. At lectures he sat apart, scribbling phrases that had nothing to do with medicine. Spiritus contra spiritum, he wrote. Spirit against spirit. His classmates discussed nerves, hormones, and reflex arcs. Jung watched their lips move and wondered what animated them from within. It wasn't contempt, it was distance, the kind that isolates prophets before they know their own name. He began walking alone after class, letting the Rhine's gray current absorb his thoughts. Sometimes he heard inner dialogues as though his ideas had voices of their own. He did not yet fear madness, only misunderstanding. Dream of the underground city. That winter, a dream visited him 3 times. He stood before his childhood home. The upper floor was ordinary, but below it an unknown stairway descended into earth. In the dream he lit a candle and followed the steps downward. The first basement held medieval furniture. Below that, Roman stonework. Below that, rough-hewn caves where bones gleamed. At the deepest level, a golden throne waited, and on it a gigantic figure with the head of a god and the body of a man. When he awoke, terror mingled with exhilaration. He sensed the dream was not fantasy, but a message. Beneath every modern house lay a buried civilization of the psyche. He had descended through layers of history inside himself. It was the first map of what he would one day call the collective unconscious. The weight of inheritance. His father's death in 1896 sealed the split. Paul Jung, the melancholy pastor, collapsed under the weight of disbelief. Carl was 21. At the funeral, he watched the coffin lowered and felt both pity and liberation. The man who embodied failed faith was gone, but his ghost remained inside the sun. Grief pressed on him until it became a presence, an invisible counselor who murmured of futility and duty. He began to hear inner dialogues more distinctly, the son arguing with the father within. He wrote in his diary, "Now I must find my own church." But no church on earth matched the architecture rising in his dreams. Science as sanctuary. To the world he appeared calm. He buried himself in study, dissecting frogs, memorizing cranial nerves, learning the languages of the brain. Science gave structure to chaos. It promised certainty, and for a while he believed. But the microscope, like the cathedral wafer, eventually turned to ash on his tongue. He discovered that the more precisely he described the body, the less he understood the life that moved it. In the sterile glow of the lab, he sometimes felt watched from the inside. The same silent companion from childhood seemed to stand just behind his shoulder, whispering, "You will not find me in organs." The skull on the desk. He kept a human skull on his desk, a relic from anatomy class. Others found it morbid, he found it honest. He would rest his palm on its dome while reading Kant or Nietzsche. It reminded him that thought itself was built on mortality. Sometimes, staring into its hollow sockets, he felt his own consciousness looking back. The line between subject and object wavered. He understood that observation changes the observer. That insight, years before quantum physics, would anchor his later conviction that psyche and matter are reflections of one reality. Visions in the library. One rainy afternoon in the university library, exhaustion overcame him. Between shelves he drifted into half-sleep and saw, as vividly as waking, a gigantic tree whose roots coiled around a glowing stone. From the stone rose tongues of fire forming ancient letters he could not read. When he blinked, the image dissolved, leaving only the smell of dust and ink. He copied the vision in his notebook, labeling it "Symbol of Transformation." He didn't yet know that he had glimpsed the alchemical image that would later dominate his life: the lapis, the philosopher's stone, emblem of wholeness, isolation, and the whisper of madness. Friends invited him to cafes. He declined. The noise of laughter grated against something raw inside him. He preferred solitary walks where he could listen to the dialogues within. At times he feared he was going insane, but curiosity outweighed fear. If this is madness, he thought, then madness is a kind of laboratory. He began recording spontaneous thoughts, phrases, fragments of images. He noticed patterns repeating: serpents, circles, old men with keys. He realized that the psyche behaved like nature. It expressed itself in recurring forms. Later he would call them archetypes, but now they were simply companions in the dark. The medical student who dreamed too much professors noticed his brilliance but not his battles. He graduated with honors, masking turmoil behind precision. Yet during sleepless nights he felt the boundaries between waking and dreaming blur. He would see flashes of red light, faces forming in the air, landscapes made of sound. He could stop them only by sketching or writing, pinning visions to paper before they devoured him. One night he heard a chorus chanting words in an unknown language. Instead of fleeing, he listened. The language felt ancient, like the earth speaking through the human throat. He wrote down the syllables phonetically and later found similar words in Gnostic texts. The coincidence convinced him that the unconscious connected minds across time. First contact with the unseen. During his clinical rotations, he met patients suffering from hallucinations. Where others saw delusion, Jung saw meaning trying to speak. A woman claimed to have snakes in her stomach. He asked her what the snakes wanted. Her answer, "They are hunger that never ends," struck him as a revelation. He realized that psychosis might be the soul's desperate attempt to heal itself through image. Madness was not chaos, but communication misunderstood. This insight separated him from the scientific orthodoxy that ruled psychiatry. It also brought danger. Empathy with the mad opened the same door within him. He feared that listening too deeply might pull him across the threshold. The voice by the river won. Twilight, standing by the Rhine, he heard a voice clear as speech. "There is no difference between you and the river." He looked around. No one. The current shimmered like mercury under the fading sun. He felt suddenly weightless, his body dissolving into motion, his thoughts flowing downstream. For seconds, or centuries, he existed without boundary. Then the world returned, and with it terror. Had he just touched the divine or lost his mind? That ambiguity would haunt him for life. He wrote later, "The experience of the numinous is both danger and salvation." The threshold. By the turn of the century, Jung was assistant physician at the Burghölzli Asylum in Zurich, under the great psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler. From the outside, success. Inside, the knocking had become thunder. Every patient he met seemed to mirror a fragment of himself, the paranoid, the hysteric, the visionary. He began to suspect that he was drawn to madness because it spoke his native tongue. At night he dreamed of floods swallowing Europe, of crimson tides rising from the unconscious of humanity. He feared they were omens of his own breakdown. Years later, those same images would return as prophecies of the First World War. Fear of inheritance. Mental illness ran through his family like a subterranean stream. An aunt heard voices. His mother slipped into trances. He knew that to explore the unconscious was to risk becoming its prisoner, but avoidance was worse. He decided that courage was not absence of fear, but dialogue with it. He would descend deliberately, lantern in hand, rather than be dragged down screaming. That choice, to engage madness instead of repress it, was the beginning of his life's method. He wrote, "I must learn to live with the spirit of the depths, not against it." The experiment. To test himself, he began self-analysis through imagination. He would sit quietly, close his eyes, and let inner images arise. At first came chaos, swirling colors, monstrous shapes, then figures, wise old men, women with serpent hair, children of light. He spoke to them, and they answered. Sometimes he argued, sometimes he simply listened. He feared insanity, yet felt guidance within the dialogue. He discovered that if he treated inner figures with respect, they grew calm and revealed knowledge beyond intellect. This was the embryo of active imagination, the practice that would define his later work. Between science and spirit days belonged to medicine, nights to mystery. In daylight he lectured on dementia precox. In darkness he conversed with archetypes. He lived on coffee and uncertainty. The two worlds collided when he noticed symbols from his dreams appearing in patients' hallucinations. A woman described a sun emitting phallic rays, precisely the same image Jung had drawn privately weeks before. He realized the unconscious was not personal, but collective. A vast network where minds share imagery the way oceans share currents. The discovery exhilarated him and terrified his colleagues. They whispered that Dr. Jung was becoming infected by his patients. He smiled. They were partly right. The edge one night exhaustion overtook him. He dreamed he was standing at the edge of a cliff. Below, an abyss filled with swirling faces. A voice said, "Jump, and you will find the ground." He hesitated, then leaped, and discovered he was flying, not falling. He awoke trembling, but alive, convinced that surrender, not resistance, was the path through fear. He wrote later, "One does not overcome darkness by fighting it, but by going through it." The naming of the journey. Looking back, he realized that what others called breakdown was, for him, the call to individuation, the summons to become whole. The fainting fits, the isolation, the visions, even the terror were not symptoms but messages. They were the psyche's way of demanding participation. To ignore them would have been true madness. He began telling students, "Beware of your own medicine. The soul will not be treated as an object. It insists on being the experimenter." They laughed nervously. He was already decades ahead of them, building a psychology that included mystery. A note on fear. Fear never left him. It merely changed shape. He learned to treat it as a compass rather than an enemy. When anxiety rose, he asked, "What is it pointing toward?" That question became central to his therapy. He would teach patients to enter their fears, to find meaning inside panic. The lesson was born here, in his own trembling nights. Closing reflection. Every prophet of the inner world begins with a wound. For Jung, the wound was the split between mind and spirit, between logic and vision. The fainting child, the haunted student, the solitary doctor, they were all stages of one initiation. He had answered the call to madness and discovered that beneath madness lies order waiting to be translated. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. But whoever looks within awakens. Carl Jung. The knock had become a doorway. Beyond it waited the next chapter, the world of the asylum, the meeting with Freud, and the storm that would shake both science and the soul. The Psychiatrist of Shadows, Burghölzli Years. At 29, Carl Gustav Jung walked through the iron gates of the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, a castle of corridors perched above the lake. Wind carried the scent of ether and pine through the windows. Behind the walls waited hundreds of forgotten minds, voices that spoke in languages no one tried to translate. For most doctors, Burghölzli was a post of duty. For Jung, it was a monastery of mysteries. He had been drawn to psychiatry because it stood between worlds, half laboratory, half cathedral. Here, the mind was both specimen and spirit, and within days he realized the shadows he had met inside himself were alive in others. The House of Broken Time. Burghölzli at the turn of the century was a microcosm of Europe's unease, a walled city of dreamers, prophets, hysterics, and forgotten farmers whose sentences ended mid-air. Electric lights buzzed softly over white tiles, footsteps echoed down endless corridors. Each door was a boundary between waking and nightmare. Jung kept meticulous notes, but beneath the clinical tone lay awe. He wrote, "Every patient is a living question." He approached them not as curiosities, but as fellow travelers lost in deeper layers of the same labyrinth. The Woman Who Heard Snakes. Her name was Sabina Spielrein, a brilliant young Russian, 19, with dark eyes that flickered between terror and intellect. When Jung first met her, she was screaming, convulsed by visions of snakes winding through her stomach. Other physicians recorded hysteria. Jung saw a symbol trying to speak. He sat beside her bed, voice steady, and asked softly, "What do the snakes want?" Her breathing slowed. "They want to eat me," she whispered, "or to be born." That sentence opened a lifetime of discovery. He realized that what modern medicine called delusion might be myth in raw form, a dream forced into daylight. He began to treat her not by suppressing the image but by following it, asking it what it meant. Each session became an excavation of meaning. The talking cure, reborn Freud's writings, had just begun to circulate through Europe, whispering of repression and the unconscious. Jung devoured them, testing every idea against his own experience. But he brought something to Freud's method that Vienna had never imagined: reverence for the symbolic. He treated words as fossils of emotion, dreams as geological strata of the soul. In Sabina he found both a patient and a mirror. She responded to analysis with startling insight, teaching him as much as he taught her. Together they discovered the transformative value of emotion, that what terrifies us can also heal us when understood. Later, their relationship would drift toward dangerous intimacy, but in these early months it was a meeting of two awakening minds, the analyst and the analyze, and each half of a single experiment in human depth. Mapping the invisible. To make his intuition visible, Jung designed experiments with electrodes and words. Patients heard a list of terms: mother, death, love, money, and pressed a telegraph key to time their associations. Where reactions slowed, emotion hid. He plotted results on paper and found that feelings formed clusters, islands of charged meaning. He called them complexes, little constellations orbiting the conscious ego, influencing behavior like unseen planets. He realized that we do not have complexes. They have us. A forgotten humiliation, a secret desire, a buried fear. Each could seize control of speech, heartbeat, thought. Psychology had discovered its atoms, science and compassion. Jung's colleagues admired his precision but puzzled over his warmth. He spoke gently with patients others avoided. He visited them after hours, listening as they described invisible voices. Instead of contradicting them, he asked the voices names. He found that acknowledgement soothed madness more than restraint. He began to suspect that the human psyche sought dialogue, not domination. The insane were those whose inner voices had gone unanswered too long. To heal them was to resume conversation. The asylum as mirror weeks blurred into seasons. Each morning he walked past the same windowed corridor where patients stared at reflections on glass. He wondered who was truly confined, them or him. Their visions were crude but honest, stripped of the polite mask society wears. He saw in them the same archetypes that haunted his dreams: the mother, the serpent, the wise old man, the devouring god. He wrote, "Inside every normal person lives a crowd of lunatics. Bergholzli merely removes the walls between them." At night he sketched faces from memory, half angel, half beast, then locked the drawings away. They frightened him because they were beautiful. Letters to Vienna. Through correspondence he reached out to Sigmund Freud, already a legend. Freud read Jung's papers on word association and replied with warmth, "Dear colleague, I recognize in you the crown prince of psychoanalysis." For Jung, this was benediction. At last, another who understood that the unconscious was real. Their letters became a lifeline of intellect and paternal affection. Yet beneath the admiration, tension coiled. Freud saw libido as sexual energy. Jung suspected it was broader, the energy of life itself, creative and destructive. But for now, he suppressed disagreement. He needed guidance, not war. Sabina's recovery months passed, and Sabina changed. The screaming ceased. She began studying medicine under supervision, walking freely in the hospital gardens. She spoke of her illness as rebirth. Through the snakes, I became conscious. Her insight confirmed Jung's faith in the psyche's self-healing power. They continued to meet, sometimes exchanging letters laced with confession and philosophy. The boundary between doctor and student blurred, and guilt followed. Jung felt the same split returning. Personality number one demanding restraint, personality number two yearning for union of souls. The tension would shadow him for years, reminding him that every healer also bleeds. The Laboratory of the Soul. By 1907, his experiments had made him a rising star. He published studies in word association, proving with data that emotion can be measured. But behind the graphs lay poetry. He had given scientific language to the invisible currents of feeling. He called this bridge between science and myth psychic energy. His office is filled with symbols, Egyptian scarabs, alchemical engravings, and medieval manuscripts. He felt guided by an invisible tradition, as if the spirits of forgotten scholars had taken up residence on his shelves. Colleagues joked that Jung's laboratory looked more like a chapel. He smiled. They were not wrong. When the walls spoke back, one evening while writing notes, a patient began screaming that the hospital walls were alive. Jung hurried to her ward. She pointed at the plaster. They breathe. He placed his hand against the wall. Cold, still. Yet for a fleeting instant he felt a pulse under his fingers. He said nothing. Later he recorded the moment as evidence that empathy can blur the boundary between observer and observed. The psyche, he realized, is contagious. Shadows and mirrors. As his reputation grew, Jung noticed a dangerous pride creeping in. He was the brilliant young doctor, Freud's favorite, husband, father, scientist. But success built a wall between him and the raw experience that had guided him here. He wrote in his diary, "The danger of becoming respectable is greater than that of becoming insane." He sought humility in manual labor, chopping wood, repairing fences. Physical work grounded the visions. He began to dream again, not of cathedrals or gods, but of simple stones, tools, rivers. He understood that intellect without earth becomes sterile. The seeds of future conflict. By 1908, he was traveling to Vienna, meeting Freud in person. Their conversations lasted for hours, two explorers mapping the same unseen continent from opposite coasts. Freud admired Jung's energy but warned him against mysticism. Jung nodded, hiding the inner fire that mysticism had already lit. He sensed that the alliance would one day rupture, but for now he needed the apprenticeship. Back in Zurich, he returned to the hospital renewed yet restless. He could feel another threshold approaching, the limit of institutional medicine. The deeper he listened to patients, the more he heard myth speaking through madness, and science had no words for myth. The farewell to Burghölzli. After nearly a decade, Jung left the asylum. He had entered as physician, departed as visionary. He carried notebooks full of dreams, data, and sketches that looked more like scripture than science. He wrote, "The walls of Burghölzli were mirrors. I went in to cure others, and came out knowing that I too am one of them." The experience left him both proud and haunted. He had touched the border between sanity and revelation, and discovered that they share the same soil. Closing reflection. In those years among the mad, Jung learned that darkness listens. He saw that healing requires conversation, not conquest, that every delusion hides a fragment of wisdom, and that the physician's own shadow walks beside every patient. He emerged convinced that the unconscious was not enemy but ecosystem, a wilderness demanding respect. Burghölzli had been his apprenticeship in humility. It taught him that compassion is the highest form of knowledge, and that those who gaze into madness must do so with a lantern in one hand and a mirror in the other. The spirit of the depths demanded I turn toward the sick, for they were the teachers I needed most. Carl Jung Freud and the fracture. There are friendships that change history, and there are fractures that make new worlds possible. When Carl Jung first met Sigmund Freud, he thought he had found a father of the soul. When he left him, he realized he had become one himself. Between them lay 8 years of passion, faith, and betrayal, the psychological equivalent of a great religious schism. The meeting in Vienna. It was spring of 1907. Jung arrived in Vienna carrying a thick portfolio of case studies and a heart full of hope. He had read the interpretation of dreams like revelation. Here, at last, was someone who dared to speak of the unconscious as a living reality, not as pathology. Freud, 20 years older, welcomed the young Swiss with warmth. They spoke for 13 hours straight. The servants went to sleep, the lamp burned low. The two men, pacing and gesturing, mapped the human mind as if it were a newly discovered continent. Freud found in Jung the son he never had. Jung found in Freud the believing father he had lost. They left that first meeting convinced that together they could bring light to the dark continent of the mind. Discipleship. For a time the bond was absolute. Freud called Jung his crown prince. He sent him letters almost daily, pages of speculation, confession, paternal advice. Jung answered with reverence, hiding the unease that occasionally flickered beneath. Vienna adored Freud's certainty. Zurich adored Jung's charisma. Together they founded a movement, the Psychoanalytic Society, a brotherhood of explorers sworn to map repression and dream. They believed that if humanity could understand its buried impulses, war and superstition would vanish. For a while it seemed the 20th century itself would be born under their shared banner. The dream of the house. Yet in Jung's dreams the ground was already cracking. One night he saw himself in a grand two-story house. The upper floor was elegant. Portraits, furniture, reason itself. Descending to the basement, he found medieval rooms, then Roman foundations, then primitive caves. Bones lay scattered in torchlight. From the darkness came the smell of earth, older than memory. When he told Freud, the older man smiled. Wish fulfillment, he said. The house represents your psyche. Civilization above, instinct below. But Jung felt Freud had missed the essence. The dream wasn't about repression. It was about depth, about history written into the soul. It was the same underground city he had visited in childhood, and he began to sense that Freud's house stopped too soon. The father complex. Their correspondence grew heavier with emotion. Freud wrote, "Promise me you will never abandon the sexual theory. It is our bulwark." Jung hesitated. He admired the old man's courage, but saw dogma forming where discovery should live. To disagree felt like patricide. He told a colleague, "To me, Freud is the greatest living psychologist, and the most tragic." The more Jung questioned libido as mere sexual energy, the more Freud clung to it. He needed certainty. Jung needed freedom. Their letters began to sound like scripture arguing with poetry. The journey to America. In 1909, they sailed together to America for a series of lectures at Clark University. Photographs show them side by side on the ship's deck, Freud stiff in coat and hat, Jung smiling faintly at the horizon. During the voyage, they analyzed each other's dreams. When Freud refused to reveal his own, citing fear of losing authority, Jung felt a tremor. A doctor afraid of his unconscious was like a priest afraid of his God. Yet on the stage in Massachusetts they shone. The American press called them the Columbus and Magellan of the psyche. Afterward, Freud fainted twice on the return trip. Jung helped him to bed, sensing that something invisible had shifted, as though the old king had seen for an instant that the crown no longer fit. The unconscious unbound. Back in Zurich, Jung began to write independently. He spoke of libido not as sexual drive, but as universal energy, the current that animates myth, art, religion, and love alike. He quoted alchemists, Buddhists, tribal lore. To Freud, this was heresy. To Jung, it was wholeness. He lectured, "Within each man lives not only his personal unconscious, but the experience of the entire human race." He called it the collective unconscious, a realm of inherited symbols, the universal library of the soul. Freud warned him, "You are drifting into mysticism." Jung replied, "I am drifting into reality." The fracture had begun. The Riff Wyden's letters turned from affection to argument. Freud accused Jung of abandoning science for metaphysics. Jung accused Freud of reducing spirit to anatomy. Freud insisted that religion was neurosis. Jung countered that the loss of religion was neurosis. Their disciples took sides. Conferences became battlefields of polite hostility. Jung's dreams filled with images of crumbling statues and fathers who would not die. He realized the struggle was archetypal. The son must slay the father to be born. He tried to speak gently. He wrote, "My dear professor, your concept of sexuality is the cornerstone of your building, but for me it is only one wall among many." Freud read the letter as betrayal. The breaking point. In 1912, Jung published Symbols of Transformation. It reinterpreted myths and dreams as expressions of psychic energy transcending sexuality. Freud read it in silence, then sent a curt note. "This is pure mysticism. You have thrown away the key to the human mind." Jung felt the sentence was like excommunication. At their next meeting in Munich, words finally broke. Freud accused, Jung defended. Hours passed. Then, mid-conversation, Freud fainted, collapsing into Jung's arms. When he revived, Jung whispered, half in sorrow, "The father is dead." They would never truly speak again. Aftermath. The rupture cost Jung his position in the International Psychoanalytic Association. Friends drifted away, journals mocked his occultism, yet freedom tasted sweet. He walked by the Zurich lake and felt air return to his lungs. He no longer had to guard the throne of another man's theory. He could build his own house, one with basements and roots and ghosts intact. The vision of the flood. Shortly after the break, Jung dreamed of a monstrous flood covering Europe, drowning cities, leaving only mountains untouched. From the waters rose a voice. "This will soon come to pass." He woke shaken, convinced it was not personal, but collective. 2 years later, World War I erupted. He wrote, "The dream was prophetic. The unconscious of Europe burst into the world." The vision convinced him that the psyche and history are mirrors. What is repressed in the individual becomes violence in the crowd. He would spend the rest of his life warning civilization against forgetting its shadow. Reflection on the father. Years later, he could speak of Freud with tenderness. "He was a great discoverer," Jung said, "but he built a dam too small for the river." Without Freud, there would have been no Jung. Without Jung, Freud might have remained a prophet in a narrow temple. Their quarrel, painful as it was, fertilized psychology itself. He wrote in his journal, "We must thank our enemies. They complete our destiny." The house revisited. One evening in his 40s, he dreamed again of the house. The basements were deeper now, their walls carved with new symbols. At the lowest level, water shimmered. He knelt and saw his reflection, not as a child or disciple, but as a builder. The house no longer frightened him. It was home. The father's voice was gone. In its place, he heard silence, vast and kind. The concept of the unconscious. Out of the wreckage of friendship rose his clearest vision. The psyche, he now understood, was not a machine driven by instinct, nor a chaos of repressed memories. It was a self-organizing cosmos, an inner nature striving toward wholeness. Its language was a symbol, its process, transformation. Consciousness was only a small island in that ocean, lit briefly by reason before sinking again into dream. Freud had mapped the coastline. Jung would explore the sea. The human cost. The price of independence was isolation. He lost colleagues, sleep, and direction. He wandered Europe's libraries haunted by doubts. Was he becoming the very mystic Freud had feared? At times he wished the old man would write again, scolding him, anchoring him. But silence is also a teacher. In that silence he heard new voices, inner guides preparing him for the descent that awaited. The visions of the Red Book, the dialogues with the soul. The fracture had freed the spirit of the depths. Closing reflection. What began as an alliance ended as initiation. Jung entered Freud's circle as a scientist and left as a pilgrim. Between them lies the story of every generation that outgrows its gods. Freud gave the world the courage to face desire. Jung gave it the courage to face meaning. Their quarrel still lives inside each of us, between skepticism and faith, analysis and imagination, reason and dream. One does not discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore. Jung. And so, having lost his shore, he turned toward deeper water, toward visions waiting below, the next chapter of his journey into the underworld of the psyche. Descent into the unconscious. The Red Book. There comes a moment when knowledge fails and the soul demands experience. For Carl Jung, that moment arrived in the winter of 1913 when the walls between waking and dreaming collapsed, and the man who had once lectured on sanity began deliberately to enter madness. He would later call it his confrontation with the unconscious. Others would whisper that he had gone insane. Both were true. The visions begin. It began with a flood. One night Jung saw Europe submerged beneath crimson waves, cities vanished beneath oceans of blood. From the Alps, Switzerland stood like an island untouched, the last refuge of sanity. The vision returned again and again, each time louder, more detailed. A voice whispered, "This will become real." He feared hereditary psychosis, the same dark inheritance that had touched his mother's mind, that had filled his childhood with strange presences. Yet when war broke out months later, and Europe indeed drowned in blood, he realized the visions were not personal, they were collective. The world's shadow had risen to meet his own. The decision. For most men, such visions would mean collapse. For Jung, they became a summons. He understood that to heal others he must first face the storm within. He would not repress the images. He would enter them consciously, as an explorer enters uncharted land. He wrote, "I let myself drop into what I call chaos. I wanted to see what happens when one stops directing one's life by reason and lets things happen." Thus began the most dangerous experiment in the history of psychology, a journey into the underworld of the human soul. The method. Each evening after work he retreated to his study. He extinguished the lights, closed his eyes, and waited. When images arose, he followed them wherever they led, not as an observer, but as a participant. He called this active imagination. The first descent was terrifying. He fell through endless darkness until his feet touched rough stone. Before him stretched a desolate landscape, red desert under a black sky. A figure appeared. An old man with wings like a kingfisher's and eyes like ancient light. "Who are you?" Jung asked. "I am Philemon," the figure replied, "teacher of souls." Thus began a dialogue that would last for years, between the psychiatrist and his own living archetypes. The realm below. In those nights Jung wandered through a mythic geography. He crossed deserts, climbed mountains, spoke with gods, demons, and dead men. He met Elijah, Salome, a serpent of wisdom, and a red-haired giant who claimed to guard the gate of the soul. He saw cities built from crystal, oceans of black fire, gardens where time itself bloomed in spirals. He wrote everything in black ink on rough paper, then illuminated the pages with intricate paintings, circles within circles, mandalas, serpents eating their tails. These would later become the Red Book, the most beautiful diary of madness ever created. To Jung, it was not art. It was evidence, proof that the unconscious was not chaos, but cosmos. The voice of Philemon. Among the many figures who visited him, Philemon became central. He was a mentor and mirror, a living symbol of inner wisdom. "Men think they create thoughts," Philemon told him, "but it is the thoughts that create men." Jung listened. He understood that ideas are not inventions but visitations. The psyche is not a house we own, but a city through which gods wander. At times he saw Philemon outside his vision, a blue-winged figure walking beside him in the garden. His children noticed him speaking to thin air. He was careful to act normal in public, but inwardly he knew he was living two lives, one in the visible world, one in a realm more real than reality. The madness and the method. For 4 years the visions consumed him. Days belonged to patience and lectures, nights to eternity. He drew, painted, and wrote, filling page after page with dialogues between the ego and the soul. He conversed with his own shadow, argued with the devil, sought the meaning of good and evil in himself. At times he feared he would never return. But he had prepared. Manual labor, sailing, carpentry. The physical world became his anchor. His wife, Emma, tended to him with quiet loyalty. She heard him pacing at night, speaking to invisible companions, but never called a doctor. She knew he was undergoing something sacred. He later said, "I took every care to remain in contact with the world of daily reality. Otherwise, I might have lost myself completely." The Book of Blood and Light. The pages of the Red Book shimmer with contradiction. There is horror and beauty, sin and revelation. In one vision, he killed the hero within himself, only to watch a new god rise from the wound. In another, he drank blood from a chalice and saw his reflection as both man and beast. He realized that transformation required destruction, that the soul renews itself by devouring its own. Images. Where love reigns, he wrote, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking. These words were not philosophy. They were survival notes written from inside the storm. He came to understand that the unconscious is not only personal memory, but the history of all humanity, a living myth factory producing symbols that sustain existence. To reject it is to starve the soul. To integrate it is to become whole. Salome and the shadow. Among his inner figures, none disturbed him more than Salome, the dark feminine companion to Elijah, embodiment of Eros and death. She called him my lover, but Jung resisted, sensing the danger of seduction by the unconscious. Yet he learned that to reject her was to remain divided. The soul, he discovered, is androgynous, a marriage of masculine and feminine, reason and passion, light and darkness. This insight would later crystallize into his idea of anima and animus, the inner opposite each person carries. But in these years it was lived, not theorized. He wrestled with the archetype of the feminine as Jacob wrestled with the angel, until dawn broke inside him. The death of the old god. During one vision he found himself before a vast cathedral. God sat upon the throne, radiant yet distant. Then to his horror, God defecated upon his own church, a blasphemous image echoing the dream of his childhood. Instead of revulsion, Jung felt liberation. He understood. Divinity was evolving. The old god of law and hierarchy was dying so that a new image of the divine, one that included darkness, could be born. He wrote, God is not dead, he has become unconscious in man. This was the revelation that shattered his theology and rebuilt it. It would echo decades later in Answer to Job, his most controversial book. But its seed was planted here, in the red glow of vision. The creation of the self, in the center of the Red Book. Jung painted a circle, a radiant mandala with 4 gates and a golden core. He called it the self, not the ego, but the organizing principle of the psyche, the divine center toward which all consciousness moves. He realized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, was not self-improvement but self-sacrifice. One must allow the old identity to die so that the greater personality, the self, can emerge. The ego's task is to serve the self, not rule it. He wrote, the way is not straight. It is a spiral that circles around the center, each turn bringing you closer to what you are. The light of Philemon. As the years passed, Philemon's voice softened. He told Jung that he had fulfilled the descent. The God you seek lives in the depths of your own soul, he said. Now return to the world and teach men to listen. Jung obeyed. He closed the great red volume, bound it in leather, and placed it in a drawer. He would not show it to anyone for decades. The world was not ready, and neither was he. He feared it would be mistaken for madness when it was really medicine. Emerging from the underworld. By 1918, the fever subsided. The visions grew quiet, like waves receding after a storm. Jung stepped out of the underworld not as the man who had entered, but as someone remade by fire. He said, I learned that one must give the unconscious a chance to live, for without it we are only half alive. He built stone towers, sailed his boat, played with his children. But behind every ordinary gesture pulsed a secret radiance, the knowledge that reality is more than it appears, that every human carries a myth unfolding within. The Red Book. Hidden for the rest of his life, the Red Book remained unseen, locked in a cupboard at his home in Küsnacht. Visitors would notice the heavy crimson volume on the shelf, but he spoke of it only as the nucleus of all my later work. He feared that its images, gods, serpents, burning suns, would be misunderstood in an age that had forgotten symbols. When it was finally published nearly 50 years after his death, the world gasped. Here was not a scientist but a prophet, a man who had painted his own apocalypse and resurrection. It was as if the gospel of the psyche had been discovered. rebirth, Jung emerged from his private inferno transformed. He had met madness and found meaning inside it. He no longer feared darkness. He had learned to speak its language. He wrote, I have learned that the greatest danger is not the devil in the world, but the devil in ourselves when we refuse to see him. This was not romanticism, it was responsibility. To see one's own shadow, to love it without surrendering to it, is the highest act of courage. The man who once feared fainting now guided thousands through their own descents. He taught that neurosis is not failure, but invitation, the psyche's way of forcing consciousness to expand. We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, he said, but by making the darkness conscious. Myth made flesh. When people asked what the Red Book was, he smiled. It is the story of how I became myself, he said, but privately he knew it was larger, a document of humanity's rebirth through one man's descent. Every page was a map of the underworld, showing that beneath fear lies creativity, beneath madness, meaning, beneath death, transformation. The journey taught him that the soul speaks in images, that our dreams are letters written from eternity, and that ignoring them is the true insanity of modern life. Closing reflection. Out of terror came beauty, out of madness, method, out of solitude, the discovery that every human being is a bridge between heaven and hell. The descent into the unconscious was not Jung's breakdown, it was his baptism. He returned carrying the knowledge that psyche itself is sacred, that each of us contains a Philemon waiting to be heard, and that the gods we lost have only changed address. They now live within us. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens. The doctor who once feared losing his mind had instead found his soul, and from that soul's red-inked pages would rise a new psychology, one not of symptoms, but of symbols, not of illness, but of initiation. The Tower and the Earth, Bollingen. There comes a season when the soul no longer seeks ascent, but roots. After years spent in the storm of visions in the depths of the unconscious, Carl Jung turned not upward nor inward, but outward, toward the quiet permanence of the earth. He had descended into madness and returned. Now he longed for something simpler. Stone, water, wood, fire. Something that did not speak in symbols, but in silence. It was 1922 when he first found the land, a strip of wild ground on the upper lake of Zurich, near a tiny village called Bollingen. No roads led there. One reached it only by foot or by boat. The place felt ancient, untouched, like a memory of the world before thought. Jung bought it at once. The return to stone. In the beginning there was only a hut, a single round room roughly built of gray stones taken from the lake's edge. He laid each one himself, sweating in the summer sun, his hands blistered. No architects, no blueprints, only instinct. He said, at Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself when I am building with my own hands. Each stone, he believed, carried memory, of the mountain, of fire, of the slow patience of time. To build with it was to converse with eternity. When the hut was finished, he built a hearth in its center, and above it carved a Latin inscription, Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Called or not called, God will be present. At night he sat by the fire listening to the wind in the reeds, the sound of the lake against the shore. No clock, no electricity, no telephone. Only the rhythm of the elements. The tower grows. Over the years the hut became a tower, then a second tower, then a courtyard connecting them. Each addition rose at a turning point in his life, after the death of his mother, after the death of his wife, after some inner transformation that demanded stone as witness. He said, at Bollingen, I am in the past, present, and future all at once. I have become the thing I am building. The tower had no modern conveniences. Water came from the lake, light came from oil lamps, heat from the wood he chopped himself. It was not a retreat from civilization, but a return to the elemental conditions of being human. He cooked simple meals over fire. He carved inscriptions into the walls, drew ancient symbols in the plaster, serpents, mandalas, suns. Sometimes he painted them with his own blood, as if binding the psyche to the stone. Visitors who came expecting a Philosopher's villa found instead a monk's cell beside an alchemist's workshop. They would watch him at dawn, barefoot, gray-haired, walking down to the lake in silence, his eyes reflecting both sky and depth. The rhythm of the elements. At Bollingen, Jung divided his days by the movement of the sun. Morning was for labor, chopping wood, carving stone, mixing mortar. Afternoon for reading or writing. Evening for stillness, a long gaze across the lake, the smoke of the hearth rising like prayer. He said, when you live close to the earth, you realize that time is circular, not linear. The same light returns every morning, and you too are renewed. He found solace in repetition, the scrape of shovel against soil, the scent of burning pine, the echo of footsteps in the stone hall. Every act became a ritual, every gesture an offering to the unconscious, made visible in matter. Sometimes he would stand for hours watching the ripples spread on water. He said the lake mirrored the psyche, calm on the surface, yet unfathomable beneath. He would throw a stone into its center and watch the circles widen until they vanish. That, he said softly to a friend, is how an idea moves through the collective mind. Emma's presence. Emma Jung visited often. Though she preferred the comfort of their home in Küsnacht, she understood what Bollingen meant to him. When she died in 1955, he built a memorial tower adjoining the first, a second structure rising like a soul beside the body. On its wall he carved, "She is the foundation of this house." Her death turned the tower into a dialogue between living and dead. Jung felt her presence in the wind, in the shape of the stones. He believed the building itself had become a mandala, a physical representation of his inner world. In his later years, he often said, "I do not live in my house at Bollingen. The tower lives in me." The language of stone. When words failed, Jung turned to carving. He chiseled Latin phrases and alchemical mottos into tablets. Tempori cedi, yield to time. What is above is as what is below. In each of us, there is another whom we do not know. Each phrase was a condensation of a lifetime's thought. He carved not as a mason but as a priest, each blow of the hammer echoing through the hills. The work took years, but he never hurried. He said the stones required their own pace. When visitors asked what the tower meant, he smiled. "It is myself, expressed in stone. Every man should build his own myth with his own hands." They thought he spoke metaphorically. He did not. The silence. At night, Bollingen became a world without clocks. No sound but the crickets, the distant lapping of water. Jung would sit by the fire, pipe in hand, and feel time dissolve. He said that in such silence one hears the voice of the eternal man, the one who lives in all generations. He no longer sought visions. They came when they wished. Gentle now, not consuming. He would see faces in the flames, hear faint music in the wind, and write nothing. After years of analysis, silence had become his final theory. He wrote, "In silence I am renewed. When I am alone with the stones, I speak with the ancestors." The earth, he believed, is memory. Every rock remembers fire. Every wave remembers the moon. In listening to nature, he was listening to himself. Visitors from the outer world. Occasionally, students or analysts would make the pilgrimage. They came expecting revelation. They found Jung splitting logs. He would hand them an axe and say, "Here, begin." Only after hours of shared labor would he speak of dreams, and then not as theory but as weather, something to be observed, endured, and respected. To one visitor who asked about the meaning of life, he simply pointed to the horizon and said, "Do you see how the mountains meet the sky? That line is made by your own eyes. Meaning is that line, the meeting of what is within and what is without." The earth as teacher. At Bollingen, Jung relearned what the modern world had forgotten. That spirit and matter are not opposites, but partners in creation. Each stone he laid, each fire he lit, was psychology made physical. The symbol turned flesh. He said, "The unconscious is like the earth. It produces what it pleases, but only the patient farmer learns its rhythm." He kept a small garden. He pruned the vines by moonlight, studied the shape of clouds before rain. He no longer cared for lectures or acclaim. He cared only for seasons, for the slow unfolding of the eternal present. The tower as mandala. When the tower's 4 sections were complete, it formed a circle. 4 directions, 4 walls, 4 towers around a central hearth. Jung recognized it instantly. A living mandala, the symbol of wholeness that had haunted his dreams for decades. He had painted it in the Red Book, now he could walk inside it. He called it the alchemical vessel of transformation. Here, the inner world and outer world were one. The walls stood for consciousness, the fire for the soul, the water for the unconscious, the sky for the self beyond both. When storms came, lightning struck the lake, and thunder rolled through the valley. He felt no fear. He said, "The gods have found their altar again." A day at Bollingen. Imagine it, a misty morning on the lake. Jung wakes before sunrise. He brews tea over the fire, writes a few notes in his journal, a dream about a child of light swimming in dark water. He steps outside barefoot. Dew glistens on the grass. He walks to the edge of the lake and watches the first light touch the surface. He feels the world breathing with him. No separation, no analysis, only being. For this, he had built the tower, to live not as a scholar or healer, but as a man in harmony with creation. The lessons of solitude. In solitude, Jung discovered humility. He realized that the psyche, like nature, could not be mastered, only served. He wrote, "The soul is not within us, we are within the soul." He came to see himself as a caretaker, a steward of an ancient house built by countless lives before him. The ego, he said, is merely the newest room in a mansion older than history. At Bollingen, he learned to walk those halls quietly so as not to disturb the sleeping gods. He often told his students, "When you are too much in the mind, work with your hands. When you are too much in the world, listen to your dreams. When you are too much in the heavens, touch the earth." The tower and the self. In his last years, Bollingen became less a retreat and more a reflection of his inner being. Each tower marked a different stage of his life: childhood, marriage, vision, loss. Walking among them was like walking through his own autobiography written in stone. He said, "Here, I am not the professor, not the doctor, I am simply the man who is." When asked why he chose such isolation, he answered, "Because the world is loud, and the gods speak softly." Closing reflection. At Bollingen, Jung completed the circle. He had traveled from intellect to instinct, from society to solitude, from words to silence. The tower was not a monument to his achievement, but a confession of humility, a reminder that wisdom grows not from books, but from the soil beneath them. As dusk fell over the lake, he would sit outside the tower and watch the sky dissolve into water. The fire behind him crackled softly. In the distance, church bells marked the hour, but here time had no dominion. He wrote in his diary, "At Bollingen, I am one with the things that are timeless. There, I am not what I do, but what I am." The man who once descended into the depths of the psyche had returned to the surface, not as conqueror, but as a gardener. The stones of Bollingen were his final theory, his last and most truthful book. At the tower, he said, "I belong to the earth." Encounters with the archetypes. In the long, quiet years after Bollingen, Jung began to give language to the powers he had met in vision. He no longer called them fantasies. He called them archetypes, eternal patterns of experience that live in every human being. They are older than culture, older than speech, older even than memory. They are the forms through which the psyche dreams itself into being. He said, "We are not born as blank pages. We are born as books already half written." The shadow. The first to appear always is the shadow. It is everything we do not wish to be, yet already are. It carries the instincts we repress: anger, envy, hunger, cruelty, but also the unlived virtues: courage, creativity, vitality. Jung taught that the shadow is not evil, it is potentially denied. When we ignore it, it acts out through projection. We see our darkness in others and call it their fault. When we face it, we reclaim our wholeness. He said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes. To meet the shadow is not pleasant. It appears in dreams as a rival, a monster, a stranger following in the dark street. But if we dare to speak with it, we find that the monster guards treasure. The very qualities that shame us are the seeds of our strength. He once told a patient, make a little more room in your heart for the devil. He may be your guardian angel in disguise. The task is not to destroy the shadow, but to give it sunlight. The anima and the animus. After the shadow comes a subtler figure, the inner opposite. For a man, it is the anima, the feminine soul within him. For a woman, the animus, the masculine spirit within her. These are not gender roles, but archetypal polarities. Reason and feeling, action and reflection, sword and chalice. They are bridges between consciousness and the unconscious. The anima speaks in moods, in sudden tenderness, in the pull of beauty that cannot be explained. She appears in dreams as the maiden, the mother, the muse, the witch, each face teaching him to love rather than possess. If rejected, she becomes destructive, a siren pulling the ego back into chaos. If honored, she guides him toward creativity and compassion. For the woman, the animus appears as a voice, idea, or hero, a figure who gives her words, strength, and vision. Unconscious, he turns to tyranny, the chorus of inner critics demanding perfection. Conscious, he becomes clarity, the power to think and act from the center. Jung wrote, every man carries the eternal image of woman, every woman the eternal image of man. Through them, each learns to know the other half of the soul. He saw in this union the secret of psychological marriage, not a contract between two people, but the inner wedding of opposites. When anima and animus embrace, the psyche becomes fertile, dreams blossom, art is born, love becomes understanding. The wise old man and the great mother, beyond the personal opposites, lie older powers still. Sometimes, in moments of crisis or revelation, the unconscious speaks through figures of wisdom or nurture, the wise old man and the great mother. The wise old man may appear as sage, hermit, teacher, or simply a voice in the dark saying, go this way. He represents the accumulated knowledge of humanity, the part of the psyche that remembers what the ego forgets. He is not always kind. He can be ironic, even cruel when gentleness would fail. He forces growth. Philemon was Jung's own wise old man. Through him, Jung learned that insight is not possessed, it is lent. The Great Mother is both womb and tomb, giver and taker of life. She can appear as the nurturing mother, the fertile earth, or the devouring goddess. Jung saw in her the cycle of creation and destruction that rules both nature and psyche. To know her is to know that love and loss are one movement of the same tide. When the wise old man and the great mother are reconciled within us, we begin to sense a wisdom that belongs not to the individual, but to life itself. The self, all paths, Jung said, lead toward a single image, the self. Not the ego, the small I that says mine and me, but the totality of all that we are and could be. The self is the axis around which the psyche turns, the hidden sun whose light the ego reflects as moonlight. He found its symbols everywhere, the circle, the square, the mandala, the divine child, the stone, the cross. Each expresses unity emerging from division. He wrote, the self is both the goal and the origin. It is the God within us who was always there. To approach the self is to enter a paradox. The closer we come, the smaller we feel, yet the more alive. It demands surrender, not annihilation, but participation in something greater. He called this lifelong process individuation, becoming who one truly is. It is not self-perfection, but self-realization, the slow alignment of the ego with the deeper pattern of the soul. Its signs are humility, creativity, and compassion. Archetypes in daily life. Jung warned that archetypes are not myths locked in books. They live in every encounter. The boss who humiliates may wear the mask of the father. the lover who enchants, the anima or animus, the politician promising salvation, the savior archetype seeking worship. If we recognize the pattern, we free ourselves from possession. If we do not, we become characters in someone else's dream. He told his students, "Beware of the man who believes he has no archetypes. He is possessed by one." To live consciously is to know which God is speaking through us at any moment, and to answer but not obey. The dance of symbols. Each archetype has its own rhythm. They do not vanish with age, they change form. The shadow of youth becomes the wisdom of age. The anima becomes the guide of imagination. The self becomes the quiet center that endures loss. Jung saw in this transformation the secret of meaning. We do not eliminate our contradictions, we live them until they harmonize. He said, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off the dark, but by integrating it. To integrate is to dialogue, to let each inner figure speak, to listen without fear, and to act from the center that unites them all." Modern reflections. Today we meet archetypes in new guises, in films, music, politics, even technology. The hero's journey lives in every blockbuster, the trickster in comedy, the shadow in dystopia, the wise old man in every mentor guiding a lost youth. Jung would smile and say, "The gods have moved into the cinema because the churches are empty, but they are the same gods." The collective unconscious continues to tell its stories through whatever medium humanity creates. He once wrote, "What we do not understand in our own hearts, we project into the stars." We call it mythology, but it is an autobiography on a cosmic scale. The psychological compass. For Jung, the archetypes were not dogma, they were compass points. The shadow points downward, points into instinct. The anima and animus point inward, toward relationship and imagination. The wise old man and great mother point backward and forward, to ancestry and future. The self points to the center, the still point where all opposites unite. When we lose direction, it is because we have mistaken one point for the whole. The ego believes it is the map, but the map is drawn by deeper hands. He taught that analysis, art, love, and even suffering are ways of redrawing that map until it matches the living terrain of the soul. Everyday initiations. Archetypes do not ask for worship, but participation. Every crisis is an initiation: the loss of a job, the death of a parent, the birth of a child, the failure of love. Each invites the ego to expand its vocabulary of being. The shadow demands honesty, the anima demands feeling, the wise old man demands patience, the self demands surrender. If we refuse, life repeats the lesson louder. If we accept, life becomes luminous. He summarized it simply: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Closing reflection. When asked late in life what he had learned, Jung smiled. He said that the psyche is real, that it speaks in images, and that God is a word we give to the totality of the self. The archetypes he named were never theories. They were faces of the one mystery he had met in dream and daylight alike. They remind us that every person carries within them a whole pantheon, a parliament of gods arguing toward harmony. To know them is to know life itself speaking through us. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. And in the stillness of Bollingen, as the waves folded upon the shore, he knew that privilege had been granted, for he had met his gods and by naming them had taught the world to hear its own forgotten voices. Alchemy and the marriage of opposites. When the world looked at Jung, they saw a doctor of the mind. But in his final decades he became something older, a medieval seeker reborn in the 20th century, turning pages of forgotten books where the soul still spoke in symbols of fire and gold. He had wandered through madness and returned with a question: how does the soul transform? Science gave him mechanisms, religion gave him commandments, but neither explained the process by which pain becomes meaning. Then one day in a dusty Basel library he found the key, a shelf of alchemical manuscripts written in cryptic Latin and strange diagrams of suns, serpents, and circles. He opened them and recognized his own. Dreams. The secret language. In the Renaissance, alchemists had sought to turn lead into gold, but Jung saw that their furnaces were metaphors. The lead was the unconscious, heavy, dark, instinctive. The gold was consciousness purified by encounter with its opposite. The alchemist's laboratory was the human soul itself. He said, "What the ancients called the opus alchemicum, I call the process of individuation. The strange symbols of mercury and sulfur, the mystical marriages of king and queen, the cycles of death and rebirth, these were not nonsense. They were dreams, recorded by men who had projected the work of the psyche onto matter. Where chemistry saw reactions, Jung saw revelation." He realized that humanity had always been performing psychology, only in code. The marriage of opposites. At the heart of alchemy lies a sacred paradox. Everything exists in pairs: sun and moon, male and female, spirit and matter, consciousness and unconsciousness. To heal the soul is not to choose one side, but to unite them. The alchemists called this conjunctio, the mystical marriage. Jung saw it everywhere: in myth, in love, in dream, in the creative act. Every relationship, every inner conflict is a rehearsal of that union. When the opposites embrace, something new is born. The third thing, the child, the self. He wrote, "The tension of opposites is the cradle of consciousness. Where they are reconciled, there arises the spark of the divine." This was no abstraction to him. He had lived it. Between science and mysticism, Freud and himself, sanity and vision. He understood now that the psyche's goal was not perfection, but wholeness. The furnace within. In his study at Bollingen, Jung filled notebooks with sketches of alchemical furnaces. He compared their stages, nigredo, albedo, rubedo, to psychological states. First comes nigredo, the blackening, the descent into confusion, loss, shadow, despair. He had lived it during his Red Book years. It is the death of certainty. Then albedo, the whitening, clarity returning, insight rising from chaos as if the light of consciousness is washed clean. Finally, rubedo, the reddening, the rebirth of life, the union of soul and body, the moment when spirit enters matter and transformation becomes complete. These stages were not linear but circular, the same cycle repeating through a lifetime, each return deepening the gold. He said, "The purpose of life seems to be the realization of the opposites. Where they clash, life grows." The mandala, while studying alchemy, Jung began to draw circles. Simple at first, then intricate, filled with crosses, triangles, serpents, and lotus petals. He realized they mirrored the ancient alchemical diagrams he had just rediscovered. He called them mandalas, from the Sanskrit for circle. Each was a symbol of the self, the center where opposites meet and find harmony. He noticed that patients near recovery often dreamed of circular patterns: gardens, wheels, suns, labyrinths. To him, these were the psyche's own medicine, proof that it strives for wholeness without instruction. He said, "The mandala is the psychological expression of the totality of the self." He painted one each morning at Bollingen, sometimes in color, sometimes in silence. When he felt lost, he would draw a circle and wait for order to return. "The mandala," he wrote, "is the inner Christ image that grows within me." Alchemy as mirror of the soul. The more he studied, the clearer it became. The alchemists had been describing psychic facts long before psychology existed. Their athenor, the furnace, was the heart heated by passion and pain. Their prima materia, the raw matter, was the chaos of human experience. Their philosopher's stone, that mysterious goal of the work, was the self, indestructible, radiant, whole. He saw the alchemical motto, solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine, as the rhythm of life itself. Every crisis dissolves an old form. Every healing coagulates a new one. Birth, death, love, loss, creation, all obey that same sacred chemistry. He smiled when critics called it superstition. "Alchemy is the bridge," he said, "between matter and mind." And he believed that modern man, obsessed with technology yet starved of meaning, would need this bridge again. The vision of the vessel. One night, meditating before the fire, he imagined himself inside an alchemical vessel. Flames licked the walls, vapors rose, the air shimmered like gold dust. He felt himself melting, not in fear but surrender. The ego dissolved, only awareness remained, formless, bright, vast. He sensed the unity of all things, the marriage of heaven and earth accomplished within his own heart. When he opened his eyes, the fire burned lower, but the vision stayed. He said, "The greatest experiment is the transformation of the personality into a symbol of the self." The world as laboratory. Jung began to see the entire world as an alchemical workshop. Every conflict between nations, every crisis of belief, every love affair was part of the same process, the union of opposites on a collective scale. He wrote during the post-war years, "We stand in the middle of an alchemical process, not in the laboratory, but in history itself." The atomic bomb, he said, was the literalization of psychic energy split from its soul. The cure was not new weapons, but new consciousness. Only by recognizing our darkness, he warned, can we prevent its projection into the world. The philosopher's stone. When asked late in life whether he believed in God, he replied, "I do not believe, I know." But his God was not above the world, it was within it, hidden like gold in stone. To Jung, the philosopher's stone was that divine spark incarnate in humanity, the completed self that reconciles body and spirit, finite and infinite. He said, "The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." It was not a substance but a state of consciousness, a peace that came when one stopped trying to be good and began trying to be whole. He found the symbol everywhere, in Christ and in Buddha, in alchemical drawings of the reborn king, in his own dreams of luminous spheres. Each image whispered the same truth. The treasure we seek is buried in the heart that seeks it. Transformation. In the last of his mandalas, Jung drew a circle enclosing a square enclosing a star. At its center he placed a small dot, the seed of eternity. He titled it, "The Squaring of the Circle." It represented the completion of the work, the harmony of opposites within the self. Looking at it, he said quietly, "Here I have finally expressed what I have sought all my life, the uniting of man and God, of consciousness and the unconscious, of light and shadow. This is the gold." Closing reflection. The alchemists believed that every transformation requires fire. Jung knew that the fire is experience itself, the suffering, the passion, the love that burns away illusion. He wrote, "Without the heat of emotion, nothing changes in the psyche. The marriage of opposites is not an event, but a lifelong dialogue, between thinking and feeling, strength and tenderness, faith and doubt. To live that dialogue consciously is to become an alchemist of one's own soul." And so, in the last pages of his journals, he no longer wrote of theories, but of gratitude, for the fire, for the vessel, for the endless work of becoming human. "In each of us," he said, "there is a secret gold that the world cannot see. To discover it is to turn life itself into art." The shadow of the world, Nazism and WWC. When the fires of war rose again over Europe, Jung no longer saw politics. He saw the collective psyche dreaming aloud. He had spent decades studying the shadows within men. Now he watched those shadows take form in nations. What he had faced privately in the Red Book was now being enacted on the world stage. He wrote, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." The return of the gods. In the early 1930s, Jung felt an unease spreading through Germany. It was not just political fervor, it was spiritual possession. He heard in Hitler's speeches the tone of an ancient voice, the voice of the pagan god Wotan, the restless wanderer and stormbringer of the Old Norse myths. He published an essay in 1936 titled Wotan. Few understood what he meant. Jung wrote that Wotan was an archetype, a forgotten god of fury and ecstasy rising from the collective unconscious of the Germanic people. Having been suppressed for centuries by Christianity, it erupted now in collective form. Mass rallies, flags, chants, Hunger for destiny. The god had returned, but men mistook him for a political movement. Wotan, Jung said, is the god of storm and frenzy, the unleasher of passions that sweep men away into madness. He warned that when archetypes seize a culture, reason becomes ritual, and individuals lose their souls to the crowd. What the mystic experiences inwardly, the possessed nation enacts outwardly. Visions become violence. Collective possession, Jung called it collective possession, a psychic infection in which the ego of the group is inflated by an archetypal power. People no longer act as themselves but as instruments of an idea. The symbols of religion and myth, cross, swastika, eagle, become charged with the energy of the unconscious, and masses move as one body under one spell. He compared it to psychosis. The individual who identifies with an archetype becomes a vessel of power, but also its victim. So too a nation. He watched Germany with sorrow and fascination. He had friends and patients there. He knew their culture's brilliance. Yet he saw how quickly intelligence could be devoured by myth when consciousness fails to see the shadow it casts. Accusations and isolation. During those years, Jung faced misunderstanding. Because he analyzed the Nazi phenomenon psychologically rather than politically, critics accused him of sympathy. They mistook observation for approval. He spent the rest of his life clarifying the difference. In private, he helped Jewish colleagues escape persecution, offering visas and letters of recommendation. But he also held to his conviction that moral outrage was not enough. The roots of evil lay deeper than ideology. Evil, he said, is not out there, it is in here. And if humanity refused to face it inwardly, it would return again and again in new disguises. Dreams of the apocalypse. Throughout the war years, Jung's dreams grew dark and prophetic. He saw rivers of blood covering Europe, cities in flames, a black serpent coiling across the continent. He dreamed of the Rhine turning red and the dead rising to walk among the living. He felt the same pressure he had felt before the First War, the collective unconscious erupting like magma through the crust of civilization. To friends, he confessed, I feel as if I am dreaming the dreams of a whole people. He believed the 20th century was undergoing a confrontation with its own shadow, the culmination of centuries of repression. Science had split the atom, man had split his soul. The two explosions were inevitable. Psychology of evil. In essays written during the 1940s, he tried to articulate what he was witnessing, that the greater the light of consciousness, the darker the shadow it casts. Modern man, proud of his rationality, had denied myth, God, instinct, and so these powers returned distorted, demanding worship through ideology. Communism and fascism, he said, were not opposites but twins, two faces of the same hunger for collective meaning. Both replaced the inner God with the outer state. Both required the sacrifice of individuality on the altar of mass salvation. He wrote, the gods have become diseases. Zeus no longer rules Olympus, but the solar plexus of the modern man. For Jung, the totalitarian age was not the death of religion, but its mutation. When we cease to believe in the divine within, we begin to worship the demonic without. The weight of responsibility. These insights cost him dearly. He was criticized by colleagues, questioned by governments, misunderstood by nearly everyone. But he could not stop seeing. He told a student, the psychologist who closes his eyes to evil has betrayed his science and his soul. He believed every person carried a portion of the world's shadow, and that the only way to prevent another catastrophe was for individuals to do what nations refused to integrate their darkness consciously. He said, if you imagine you are without evil, you are simply unconscious of it. The greatest danger to man is his own underestimation of evil. The world preferred comfort, but Jung knew that comfort is the prelude to blindness. The inner war. While Europe burned, Jung lived in Switzerland, cut off by borders and bomb sirens echoing across the lakes. He wrote by lamplight as the night sky glowed with distant fires. He called the war a psychic infection spreading through humanity. And yet, he said, every great evil is a challenge to the good in man. The greater the darkness, the the brighter the light must shine. He worked with wounded soldiers and refugees, listening to their dreams. Many dreamed of explosions, snakes, and floods, the same archetypal imagery he had seen before. He realized that the collective unconscious was bleeding through the veil of personal trauma. The world was undergoing a mass individuation. Painful, violent, necessary. He told a patient, "You are not only fighting for yourself, you are fighting a battle that belongs to all humanity." The vision of Wotan, fulfilled by 1945, his prophecy of Wotan had come true. Germany lay in ruins, the god of frenzy spent, his worshippers were broken. Yet Jung took no triumph in being right. He saw only tragedy. He said, "The Wotan archetype has exhausted itself in blood, but it will rise again if not understood." He believed the lesson of that era was simple and eternal. What is repressed in the soul becomes fate in the world. When a civilization denies its myths return as weapons. He warned that the same energies would now shift to new forms: technology, materialism, nationalism, even utopian dreams, each another mask for the same archetypal hunger. He wrote, "We have conquered the external world and lost the internal one. The gods are within us still, but we no longer hear their speech." The mirror of history. In the years after the war, Jung spoke more softly of politics, but more urgently of consciousness. He said humanity had entered an age where external progress outpaced inner development, a dangerous imbalance. We could split atoms, but not reconcile our own divisions. We could fly to the stratosphere, but not understand our dreams. He feared that the next war would not be between nations, but between man and his own machines, between reason and meaning. He told a journalist, "The world will ask for psychotherapy soon, but the doctor will be the soul itself." Closing reflection. Jung saw in the 20th century a grand alchemical experiment, the black stage, the nigredo of civilization. The darkness of the collective shadow had surfaced so that it could be known. The question was whether humanity would learn or repeat the cycle with new names. He wrote, "We are all participants in a vast psychic process. To stand apart from it is illusion. To understand it is redemption." The war had shown him that the fate of the world begins in the unseen corners of the individual heart. If one man ignores his shadow, it harms his neighbor. If millions ignore it, it becomes history. In the ruins of Europe, he saw both warning and hope. Out of the rubble, perhaps, a new consciousness could rise. One that would remember that every light casts a shadow, and that to deny the shadow is to lose the light. The world will not be destroyed by evil, Jung said, but by those who hide their darkness from themselves. As the smoke cleared from the fields of war, Jung returned once more to Bollingen. He walked to the lake, picked up a stone, and whispered to it the prayer of all survivors. May we remember. Near death and cosmic vision. In the winter of 1944, Jung slipped on ice outside his home in Küsnacht. The fall seemed harmless until pain tore through his chest. A heart attack followed, and for weeks he hovered between worlds. Doctors spoke in whispers. Emma sat beside him night after night, but Jung himself was already far away, drawn upward into a radiance beyond imagination. He later said, "It was as if I were suspended in space, seeing the Earth from thousands of miles above. The view from eternity." He saw the planet below him, a blue sphere wrapped in white cloud, floating in an ocean of black and gold. From that height, all divisions vanished. Mountains, borders, nations, gone. Only the living globe remained, luminous and breathing. He could see the deserts glowing like amber, the snow peaks of the Himalayas shining like silver bones, and the rivers glinting like veins of light beneath the skin of the world. He felt no fear, no pain, no attachment, only vast peace. Time itself had stopped. He wrote later, "Everything that had ever been or ever would be was there, together, spread out before me as one eternal now." In the distance, a black stone temple floated in space. Its walls shimmered with age. Its gates were carved with ancient symbols, suns, serpents, and circles. He knew without doubt that if he entered that temple, he would never return to Earth. He longed to go in, the voice of the healer. But as he approached, a figure appeared, The image of his doctor transformed into the ancient Greek healer Asclepios. The figure spoke, "Your work on earth is not yet finished. Those who need you still call your name." In that instant, Jung felt the pull of gravity return, not physical, but spiritual. The earth, that glowing sphere below, began to draw him back. He resisted. The peace of eternity was too perfect. But the call of life, of unfinished meaning, was stronger. He was pulled downward, through clouds, through light, through pain, until the narrow walls of his body closed around him again, like a shell. When he awoke, the hospital lights seemed harsh, almost unreal. He told Emma, "I am disappointed to be back." But he also said, "I have seen what waits beyond life, and I no longer fear death." The light within the body. For weeks he drifted between dimensions, half in this world, half in that radiant expanse. He could see light streaming from every object, the bed, the window, even the hands of his nurses. Everything, he wrote, seemed to live in its own eternal glow. At night, he would close his eyes and find himself once again in the blue depths of space, the earth shining below like a sacred jewel. He understood then that what religions call heaven is not a place but a state of being, the mind freed from its boundaries, seeing all life as one body. The mystery of return recovery was slow. Food tasted like dust. Ordinary conversation felt meaningless. He said, "It was as though I had returned from a great distance to a world where people were still dreaming." He felt the same grief that mystics have described after awakening, the sorrow of one who has seen the whole and must live again among fragments. Yet he knew the purpose of his return, to translate the vision into words, so that others might glimpse through him what he had seen directly. He began writing again, but the tone had changed. Before the heart attack, he had sought to prove. After it, he simply described. Certainty replaced argument. "I do not believe," he said. "I know." The cosmic marriage. What he saw in that vision was the completion of his lifelong search, the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites. He had spent decades describing it in myth and alchemy, but now he experienced it beyond symbols. Spirit and matter, light and dark, being and nothingness, all embraced within one infinite consciousness. He called it the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the sacred marriage not of man and woman, but of soul and cosmos. In that union, individuality dissolved not into oblivion, but into meaning, the sense that every human life was a note in a vast symphony, and the whole only existed because of the parts. He said, "I felt myself to be a spark of the infinite fire, and yet the whole fire was also me." The vision of the temple. Later in his journals, he tried to describe that floating temple. It was both real and symbolic, a place of timeless learning, where souls entered to remember what they had always known. He sensed the presence of all who had lived before him, ancestors, teachers, even long-dead patients. They were not ghosts, but pure awareness, each one aflame in a vast constellation of mind. He realized then that death is not annihilation, but expansion, a widening of consciousness beyond the limits of the body. To die is to awaken to the whole, and yet he also understood something more humbling, that life itself is the crucible in which eternity is refined. The purpose of incarnation is not to escape matter, but to redeem it, to make the physical world conscious of its divine origin. He wrote, "Man is the mirror in which creation becomes aware of itself." The eternal now. After his recovery, Jung would sometimes walk by Lake Zurich at dawn. He said the air seemed to shimmer, as if the veil between worlds had grown thin. He no longer prayed in words, only watched the water and felt the same silence he had known beyond time. He told a friend, "The meaning of existence is simply to be, to see, to love, to know that we are part of the whole." To him, death was no longer an end, but a return to that whole, a homecoming to the cosmic family of all life. Revelation and humility. He never spoke of his vision as revelation. He feared that to call it that would make it smaller. Instead, he called it the experience of being. He said, "It is not necessary to believe in the afterlife. It is enough to know that consciousness cannot be destroyed, only transformed." He had seen beyond religion, beyond dogma. For him, God was not an idea, but the totality of existence, the light that both creates and dissolves, the mystery that looks at itself through human eyes. He began to write with quiet authority. Life is a short pause between two great mysteries, what was before birth and what follows death. The pause, he said, is where the universe becomes self-aware. The glimmer of return. In his final years, Jung would recall that moment above the earth as the purest truth he had ever known. He often described it not with fear but longing, toward a gentle homesickness for the eternal. Yet he also thanked fate for sending him back. Had I not returned, he said, I would never have known the value of the smallest things. The cup of coffee, the touch of a hand, the laughter of a friend. The world, once seen from eternity, becomes holy. He told his students, when I die, I shall not disappear. I shall be where I have always been, in the depths of the human soul. Closing reflection. Jung's near-death experience was not the end of his story. It was its revelation. All his studies, all his symbols, all his dreams had pointed to this one truth, that the psyche and the cosmos are one continuum, and death is but a change of focus. From that luminous height, he saw humanity as a single heartbeat in the body of creation, brief, beautiful, and essential. The world beyond, Jung said, is not somewhere else. It is here, only brighter. And so he returned, to finish the work of teaching others that within the smallest human life lives the reflection of the infinite. The integration, Ion, answer to Job. After his vision of the earth from above, Carl Jung no longer wrote as a psychologist alone. He wrote as one who had looked into eternity and returned with a language for the human soul. He had seen the unity beyond opposites, but he knew that most of humanity still lived divided, between good and evil, between spirit and matter, between the God we worship and the darkness we deny. In his final works, Aeon and Answer to Job, he set out to heal that split, to integrate what Christianity, science, and modern man had torn apart. The Age of Ion. In 1951, Jung published Ion, a vast meditation on the image of Christ and the evolution of human consciousness. He began with a startling claim that Christianity itself was not just a religion, but a psychic event, a collective symbol of the self unfolding through time. For Jung, Christ was the living image of divine wholeness, but also the beginning of a paradox. The figure of Christ represented one half of the total psyche, the light, the compassion, the divine reason. Yet by exalting the light alone, the other half, the shadow, had been cast into darkness. He said, "The Christ image has become too bright, it casts too dark a shadow." That shadow, Jung believed, was the Antichrist, not a supernatural villain, but a symbol of everything excluded from the official image of God: instinct, destruction, sexuality, pride, power, rage, all that humanity declared evil and refused to integrate. The apocalypse, then, was not punishment from heaven. It was the psyche's demand for balance. The two fishes of Pisces. In Ion, Jung turned to the stars for symbols. He noted that the Christian era had coincided with the astrological age of Pisces, the sign of two fish swimming in opposite directions. One fish represented Christ, the other his opposite, the Antichrist. The age, he said, had been defined by this tension, a cosmic polarity between light and darkness. Now that era was ending and humanity was entering the age of Aquarius, an epoch that would demand the integration of opposites. The water-bearer pouring from his vessel symbolized the conscious recognition of the unconscious, the flood of psychic contents, once hidden, now emerging into daylight. He warned, "The new age will not save us, it will test us. For when man becomes aware of God within, he also becomes responsible for the devil within." Jung did not mean this as astrology or superstition. It was myth as mirror, the heavens reflecting the transformations of the human mind. The Shadow of God. His next book, Answer to Job, was written in a kind of holy fury. For decades, Jung had wrestled with one question: how could an omnipotent, loving God allow innocent suffering? He had seen that same question in his patients, in the children orphaned by war, in the haunted eyes of the survivors of Auschwitz. Religion offered obedience, but Jung sought understanding. He turned to the oldest story of divine injustice, the book of Job. Job, the righteous man, is tormented by God to prove his loyalty. His children die, his body rots, his life collapses, and yet he refuses to curse God. When God finally appears, he offers no explanation, only power. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? For most, this was a divine mystery. For Jung, it was divine unconsciousness. God, he argued, was still evolving. In Job's suffering, God confronted his own shadow, his capacity for cruelty, rage, and blindness. He wrote, Job is morally superior to Yahweh, for Job knows suffering, while Yahweh knows only omnipotence. That was the blasphemy of Jung's insight, and its brilliance. He saw that consciousness did not belong only to humanity. Even the divine needed to evolve. The birth of the Christ within Jung believed the incarnation of Christ was God's own act of self-reflection, the divine shadow seeking integration through humanity. By becoming human, God entered the field of moral conflict for the first time. Through suffering and compassion, he began to know himself. But that process, Jung said, was unfinished. Christ, the sinless one, represented only the light. The dark half remained unredeemed. That task, Jung argued, had now passed to humankind. The continuation of the incarnation, he wrote, is the realization of God in man. Each person who faces their own shadow advances that divine process a little further. Every act of moral awareness, every moment of compassion for one's darkness, is a step toward the reconciliation of heaven and hell. To Jung, this was not metaphor. It was cosmic psychology. The universe itself was striving for consciousness, and the human psyche was its instrument. The Scandal of Integration. When Answer to Job was published in 1952, the reaction was explosive. Theologians called it heresy, priests called it madness, but Jung shrugged. He said, I am not a theologian, I am a witness. For him, to integrate light and shadow was not to excuse evil, but to understand it. Moral progress came not from denial, but from dialogue, from holding the tension until transformation occurs. He warned that the greatest danger was not the sinner who knows he sins, but the righteous man who believes he has none. For such men project their evil onto others, creating devils wherever they look. In politics, this became ideology. In religion, persecution. In the soul, it became repression and disease. The man who does not confront his shadow, he said, will meet it in the flesh of his neighbor, the God who suffers. In his later years, Jung spoke often of a God who needs man. It was a reversal of theology, but an affirmation of a relationship. The divine, he said, is not perfection looking down from above, but totality striving toward consciousness through creation. Human suffering, then, is not meaningless. It is participation in the evolution of the divine image. He wrote, man's suffering is God's suffering in man. This idea transformed the meaning of faith. Prayer became not submission, but collaboration. Sin became not condemnation, but ignorance. And redemption became not an event in history, but an inner process unfolding within every human being. Light and shadow. United through Ion and Answer to Job, Jung offered not comfort, but wholeness. He did not want a world of saints. He wanted a world of conscious beings, people who know they are capable of both creation and destruction, and choose awareness over blindness. He wrote, wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. To integrate, he said, is to suffer consciously, to stand between opposites without fleeing to one side. It is the work of a lifetime, and the true meaning of individuation. He told a student, do not seek to be good, seek to be whole. Goodness without shadow is only half alive. The philosophical. Turning philosophically, Jung's later writings stood between theology and physics, between myth and quantum mechanics, between Christ and chaos. He saw in all creation the pattern of polarity, electron and proton, yin and yang, order and entropy, death and renewal. and he saw in man the microcosm of that universal law, a living vessel where the cosmos reconciles itself. He wrote, "The opposites are the engine of existence. Without tension, there is no consciousness. Without shadow, no light." And so, to live consciously was to participate in the eternal process of creation, to help the universe know itself. The courage to know evil. In one of his final lectures, Jung looked at the world still trembling from war and said, "Evil is no myth." He urged his audience not to despair, but to understand that every act of destruction is also a call to greater awareness. The only antidote to evil, he said, is the enlargement of consciousness. He believed humanity now faced the same trial as Job, to confront the God image within and accept both its light and its terror. Only by doing so could we move from fear to knowledge, from faith to participation. Closing reflection. In Ion and Answer to Job, Jung reached the summit of his life's thoughts. He gave language to the mystery he had glimpsed in dreams, faced in madness, and seen from beyond the body. He had turned psychology into cosmology, and the soul into the battlefield of creation. "The future of mankind," he wrote, "depends on the moral transformation of the individual. There is no collective salvation without inner awareness. To integrate is to become a mirror for the divine, a vessel in which light and darkness finally recognize themselves as one. And in that moment the age of opposites ends, and a new consciousness begins, not in heaven, but here, in the human heart that dares to contain the whole." India and the Mirror of the East. When Jung first set foot in India in 1938, the air felt ancient. It was not just the age of temples or the smoke of incense. It was the weight of centuries that had turned inward instead of outward. He had come from a Europe that measured itself by progress, but here, time seemed to move in circles, not toward invention, but toward awakening. He wrote, "In India, the psyche is the world." To the East, the inner life was not a metaphor. It was the fabric of reality itself. And to Jung, that was both wondrous and dangerous, the two eyes of humanity. He began to see that the world had two eyes. The West turned outward, toward matter, conquest, science, and history, and the East turned inward, toward meditation, detachment, and timelessness. Each had developed one half of human potential. The Western mind had learned to master the world. The Eastern spirit had learned to master the self. But now, Jung feared, each had gone too far in its own direction. He said, "The West has conquered matter but lost the soul. The East has conquered the soul but forgotten matter." He saw the future not as domination of one over the other, but as their marriage, a new consciousness born from both eyes open. The Temples of Stillness. Traveling through Calcutta, Delhi, and the foothills of the Himalayas, Jung met sadhus who lived in silence for decades, and scholars who spoke of Brahman, the eternal reality beyond all forms. They spoke of Atman, the inner self, and he was startled to hear echoes of his own psychology in their language. To them, the self was not merely personal, it was universal, the same essence shining through every being. It was what he had called the collective unconscious. But here it had been known for thousands of years. He felt a strange recognition, as if his entire life's work had been an attempt to rediscover what India had never forgotten. Yet he also felt a warning, the danger of dissolution. In the calm of Indian mysticism, Jung sensed a shadow, not evil, but the temptation of disappearance. He admired the serenity of Eastern consciousness, but he also feared that in its pursuit of transcendence, it dissolved the individuality he saw as sacred. He wrote, "The Indian mind does not differentiate the ego from the self. To the Westerner, this is loss, not liberation." For Jung, the human story was not about escaping the world, but about transforming it. He believed the divine sought incarnation, not release. The goal was not to dissolve into the cosmic ocean, but to bring the ocean into form, to make the unconscious conscious. In that sense, the East and West were not opposites, but stages of one process. Contemplation and incarnation, vision and embodiment, meeting the mirror. During his months in India, Jung attended ceremonies, visited ashrams, spoke with scholars, and was received by the Maharaja of Mysore, who gave him a Sanskrit manuscript on yoga. He admired the grace of it all, the ancient unity of philosophy, art, and ritual. But when he stood before a massive stone statue of Vishnu, serene and still, surrounded by devotees, he felt something unsettling. He wrote later, "The God here is too alive. One feels that if he should open his eyes, the world would dissolve." In that moment he understood both the beauty and the terror of the East, its intimacy with eternity, and its indifference to the temporal. He realized that while the East sought to wake from the dream of existence, the West was meant to dream more deeply until it understood its own dreamer. The two were mirrors, each reflecting what the other denied. Bridging two worlds. When Jung returned to Switzerland, he carried with him not answers, but balance. He began to integrate Eastern symbolism into his own thought. The mandala, the lotus, the serpent of Kundalini rising through the spine. He saw them as psychic maps, archetypal images of transformation that belong to all humanity. He said, "Yoga is the Western man's medicine, but only when translated into the language of his own soul." He did not want the West to become the East, but to learn from it, to bring meditation into matter and technology into service of spirit. Only by joining both eyes of the world, he believed, could humanity see itself whole. The river and the stone. On his last day in India, Jung stood on the banks of the Ganges at dawn. The water moved slowly, carrying flowers and ashes alike. He watched a priest release a small flame into the current, a single light floating away into the golden mist. He thought of Europe, its machines, its wars, its restless hunger. He thought of the monks meditating in the Himalayan cold, and he realized they were part of the same current, both searching for the eternal, one through matter, one through spirit, both forgetting that the eternal lives in both. He whispered to himself, "The Ganges and the Rhine flow from the same mountain." When he returned home, he wrote that his journey to the East had not been a discovery, but a remembering. He said, "The psyche is everywhere. East or West is only the direction of the wind." Closing reflection. From India, Jung brought back a quiet conviction that the next stage of human evolution would be inner, not outer. It would not come from machines or empires, but from consciousness learning to hold both East and West within itself. He said, "The East dreams of the West, and the West dreams of the East. When both awake, there will be one world." And so, the man who had once mapped the unconscious ended his journey gazing at the horizon of humanity, where the meditating soul and the scientific mind would one day meet in stillness, like two reflections of the same light. The self and the future of humanity. When the last century began, Jung was a young man among dreamers. When it ended, he had become its prophet. He had seen the world split by war, by ideology, by its own inventions, and yet he saw something deeper, that humanity's greatest danger was not its weapons, but its unconsciousness. He warned, "The world will ask for psychotherapy soon, but the doctor will be the soul itself." The age of the machine. As Jung grew older, the modern world raced ahead. Airplanes crossed oceans, televisions filled every home. Science had conquered the atom, and nearly itself. But in that glitter of invention, he saw something ancient stirring, a new God, born not in heaven but in circuits. He called it mass-mindedness, the collective spirit of the machine age, where individuality dissolves into noise. People no longer thought, they reacted. They no longer felt, they consumed. The more connected the world became, the lonelier each person felt inside. He wrote, "Masses are always breeding grounds of psychic epidemics. To remain an individual is a moral achievement." He foresaw an era when humanity would build technologies that mirror its own psyche, networks of thought, artificial minds, machines that dream without conscience. But he feared that if man did not first understand himself, his creations would magnify his blindness. Man, he said, is in danger of becoming a machine for machines. The loss of soul. Jung's greatest fear was not extinction but emptiness, a spiritual starvation disguised as progress. He saw that modern people had lost touch with the archetypes, with myth, with ritual, with meaning. They had replaced the temple with the factory and prayer with statistics. He wrote, "People are not destroyed by evil, but by meaninglessness." He treated patients who had everything, wealth, education, security, and yet were haunted by despair. Their symptoms were not insanity, but spiritual amnesia. They had forgotten why they were alive. For Jung, the cure was not comfort but individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole. It meant hearing the whisper of the self beneath the static of the world. It meant reconciling the opposites, not just good and evil, but logic and imagination, science and spirit, mind and myth. He told a patient, "You are not here to be normal, you are here to become yourself." Individuation in the age of noise. He imagined the 21st century with both wonder and dread. He foresaw a time of infinite communication and zero reflection, a time when people could speak to the world and yet be strangers to themselves. Technology, he said, has provided the means of connection, but not the meaning of it. He warned that as external life became louder, the inner life would grow silent. The danger, he said, was not that humanity would lose its intelligence, but that it would lose its soul. He called on future generations to remember the inner voice, the one that speaks in dreams, in symbols, in sudden intuitions. To Jung, that voice was not imagination. It was guidance from the self, the hidden core of each human being, the same source that myths once called divine. He wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." The shadow of progress. He saw clearly that progress without consciousness was simply acceleration toward chaos. Nations could build wonders, but without self-knowledge, they would repeat the same cycles of destruction under new names. He compared modern man to a sorcerer's apprentice who had conjured powers he could not control. He said, "Our greatest danger is our own mind, because it creates the world in its image. If the mind remains divided, so will civilization. If it integrates, if it learns humility before mystery, then the next stage of evolution will not be technological, but psychological." He called this the new task of humanity, to bring consciousness to the world it has built. The coming of the self. Jung believed that after 2,000 years of outward expansion, humanity was being forced inward. The next revelation, he said, would not descend from the clouds, but rise from the psyche. The gods, he wrote, have withdrawn into the unconscious. In other words, the divine is waiting inside human awareness itself, asking to be recognized. This was not mysticism, but responsibility. If the human being is the mirror in which the universe sees itself, then every act of awareness matters. Every moment of honesty, every dream remembered, every confrontation with the shadow is an act of cosmic evolution. He said, "Each of us carries the future of mankind in our own soul. To heal ourselves is to heal the species." A warning to the future. In his last interviews, he spoke softly, as if dictating to the unborn. He warned that the next centuries would test whether man can bear his own power. He foresaw environmental collapse, the cult of personality, the rise of collective hysteria in new digital forms, but he also saw hope. He said, "The more uncertain the world becomes, the more the individual must become something unshakable." That unshakable thing, he insisted, is not ideology, not creed, not machine, but the self, the inner axis that connects each person to the whole. He likened it to the still point of a turning world, a mandala at the heart of chaos. Only by finding that center within could humanity survive the storms it had created. The future of consciousness. Jung believed evolution was not finished. He saw the human species standing on the threshold of a new epoch, the birth of global consciousness. Science, myth, and psychology were converging, not to replace religion, but to fulfill it. He said, "The self is not an idea of God. It is God's presence within." When humanity finally learns to live from that center, the old conflicts will lose their fuel. The wars between nations, between genders, between belief and doubt will be seen for what they are, mirrors of one divided mind. The future, he said, depends on whether we choose wholeness over power, meaning over speed, and awareness over automation. Closing reflection. In the twilight of his life, Jung stood by the lake at Bollingen, watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the water. He thought of the civilizations that had risen and fallen, and of the ones still forming inside every human soul. He whispered to a friend, "The greatest adventure is still before us, the exploration of our own unconscious." He knew that the next frontier would not be the moon, but the mind, not the conquest of nature, but reconciliation with it. The salvation of the world, Jung said, is in the hands of the creatively conscious individual, and with that the old psychologist smiled, for he knew that consciousness itself was still evolving, and that somewhere in the dreams of the future, humanity might yet awaken to itself. The legacy of light, from Star Wars to psychology today. When Carl Jung died in 1961, the world thought it was losing a psychologist. In truth, it was gaining a mythology. The man who had once mapped dreams for patients in Zurich left behind a set of keys, to stories, to symbols, to the human condition itself. And as the decades turned, those keys began unlocking the collective imagination. Jung's ideas seeped out of the clinic and into the bloodstream of culture. Today they are everywhere, in movies, novels, therapy, even memes. Whenever people talk about finding themselves, facing their shadow, or becoming whole. Without knowing it, we speak his language every day. From archetypes to the silver screen. In the mid-1970s, a young filmmaker named George Lucas was struggling to write a space opera that felt timeless. He wanted something bigger than science fiction, a myth for the modern age. So he turned to Joseph Campbell, whose book The Hero with a Thousand Faces was directly inspired by Jung's theory of the archetypes. From that lineage, Star Wars was born. Luke Skywalker's journey mirrors Jung's map of individuation, leaving home, the ego's birth, meeting mentors, the wise old man, facing the dark side, the shadow, and finally integrating it, realizing that the light and dark are not enemies, but two halves of the same force. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, Darth Vader, the Force itself. They are Jungian symbols rendered in light and sound. The hero's quest is the psyche's journey. When audiences cheered, they were not just watching a story, they were watching themselves. Lucas later said, "I wanted to make a film that spoke to everyone on a level below words, a psychological level. Jung showed me how." And so, a Swiss doctor, long dead, helped shape the moral imagination of a new century. The myth behind every story. From there, Jung's influence spread quietly, like roots under soil. Writers, directors, and artists began using his archetypes to frame their worlds. The Shadow in Batman, Breaking Bad, and Joker. The anima and animus in romantic films like Her and Eternal Sunshine. The wise old man in The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and The Matrix. The hero's death and rebirth in every coming-of-age story ever told. Even video games and graphic novels now use Jung's map of the mind. Bosses that represent inner fears, quests that demand self-knowledge, and endings where the world heals only when the hero accepts himself. What Jung found in dreams, modern creators found in stories, and audiences recognized it instinctively. Because the unconscious speaks the same language, whether in myth, in dream, or in cinema. Therapy becomes transformation. Meanwhile, in psychology, his methods were reborn under new names: depth therapy, narrative therapy, transpersonal psychology, and even mindfulness-based work. Where Freud focused on pathology, Jung focused on potential. He believed that symptoms were not enemies, but messages, symbols through which the soul tries to speak. Today, therapists all over the world still ask Jung's most famous question: what is trying to happen through you? His concept of the shadow has become central to modern self-development, not as a theory, but as practice. Every time someone confronts their insecurities, their traumas, their contradictions, they are doing Jung's work. His once radical ideas, dream journals, active imagination, inner dialogue, are now common tools of healing. Meditation apps, self-help books, even pop psychology podcasts echo his message. Integration, not perfection. Wholeness, not virtue. He would smile to see that what was once called madness is now called growth. The scientist of the soul. Jung's legacy lives not only in art and therapy, but in the bridge he built between science and spirit. He saw no contradiction between them, only misunderstanding. In his idea of synchronicity, he described a world where psyche and matter mirror each other, where coincidences are not accidents, but expressions of a deeper pattern. At the time, physicists like Wolfgang Pauli listened. Pauli, a Nobel Prize-winning pioneer of quantum mechanics, became Jung's friend and patient. Together, they discussed the symmetry of atoms and the symmetry of dreams. They believed the same laws might govern both, that mind and matter are two reflections of one reality. Today, new fields like quantum consciousness, systems theory, and neuroscience of spirituality still echo that intuition. When scientists explore how thought shapes biology, when psychologists measure mindfulness, they walk paths Jung mapped decades before. He called his vision psychoid reality, a unified field where the physical and the psychic touch without merging. He saw in it the future of science, not as cold analysis, but as a new form of reverence. Modern culture and the inner revolution. In the 21st century, Jung's language has become everyday speech. We talk of energy, archetypes, projection, and the collective. Even marketing borrows his wisdom, designing brands around the hero, the caregiver, the rebel, or the sage. But beneath the surface of pop culture, a quieter revolution has unfolded. His vision of inner wholeness has become the foundation of mental health. From trauma therapy to creativity research, from leadership programs to AI ethics, his fingerprints are everywhere. Whenever someone says, "I just need to find myself," Jung smiles in eternity, because that was always his invitation. He once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Yet now, facing the soul has become the new frontier, the final adventure left in an overexplored world. The light that endures. Jung never wanted followers, he wanted explorers. He said the purpose of life was not to imitate the wise, but to discover the wisdom living within oneself. And so, long after his death, millions of people continue that inner pilgrimage through dreams, art, love, and solitude. He left behind not commandments, but invitations to see meaning in coincidence, to love one's shadow, to listen to dreams, to imagine the divine as a living process, to live as if every day were a dialogue with the self. His legacy is not an institution, but a light, a way of seeing the world as alive, mysterious, and worth understanding. The story that never ends. Look closely and you'll see his reflection everywhere, in therapy sessions, in movie theaters, in symphonies and silent meditations, in the language of children and the discoveries of AI. Everywhere the same story continues, the eternal dialogue between consciousness and mystery. The symbols may change, but the journey remains, the call to integrate, to awaken, to remember who we are. The world will ask you who you are, Jung said, and if you do not know, it will tell you. His life's work was to make sure we would know, to give us a map before the world's voice drowned out our own. And perhaps that is why in every generation his ideas are rediscovered, because they were never just his, they were ours, waiting to be remembered. Closing reflection. Carl Jung's legacy is not frozen in time. It breathes wherever human beings search for meaning. From the therapist's office to the movie screen, from a dream journal to a billion hearts online, his vision of the psyche lives on as both warning and hope. He taught that the light we seek outside is the light that has always burned within. And if we dare to turn inward, we find not isolation, but connection, not madness, but music. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. That privilege continues. In us, in art, in the stories yet to be told. And so the legacy of light endures, not in textbooks or temples, but in every human soul still brave enough to face its shadow and call it home. The dream of wholeness. The end of a life like Carl Jung's does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds like the closing of a long dream, quietly, gracefully, as if the dreamer knows the dawn is near. By 1961, Jung was 85. His hands, once steady on surgical tools and stone carvings, now trembled faintly when he wrote. Yet his eyes still carried the same curiosity they had when he was a boy descending the staircase in his first dream. He had traveled through madness and myth, crossed into the depths of his own unconscious, and returned with something luminous, a map, not of heaven, but of the human soul. The quiet before departure. In his final months, Jung withdrew more and more to his home in Küsnacht. Outside, the waters of Lake Zurich shimmered in the afternoon sun, just as they had when he was young. He spent long hours in silence, watching the light shift across the surface, sometimes writing brief notes that seemed half prayer, half observation. Visitors described him as radiant, not cheerful, but serene, like a man who had seen beyond the horizon. He often spoke of the rhizome, the underground root system of plants that continues to live unseen even when the stems above die. Human life, he said, is like the flower of that root, one summer's bloom, but the root remains. It is eternal. That image comforted him. For Jung, death was not an end, but a return to that hidden root, the great network of life and consciousness that nourishes all forms of being. He no longer feared it. He said once to a friend, "I don't believe in life after death. I know it." He had already glimpsed it during his near-death vision years earlier. The blue earth below, the temple suspended in light, the threshold he was not yet allowed to cross. Now, as his body weakened, he knew the temple doors were opening again. Dreams of light. In those final weeks, Jung dreamed often. He told his family that he saw a vast stone inscribed with symbols of wholeness, and from its base, golden roots spread through the earth like veins of light. Sometimes he saw trees whose roots rose upward instead of downward, joining into a glowing canopy that circled the sky. To him, these were not just dreams, they were messages from the same reality he had spent a lifetime studying. He believed that when consciousness approached its end, it began to see into its own origin. The dreams of the dying were, for Jung, like the sea returning to its source. Each morning when he awoke, he would smile faintly and say, "I have been where words cannot go." Letters from the end. Even in his last days, Jung kept writing. Small fragments, reflections, aphorisms that read like poetry. In one note he wrote, "The meaning of life is to make sense of the encounter between the inner and the outer world, between what happens to us and what we are. This meeting is the self, and death is its completion." Another reads, "The soul has a secret. It knows that we are more than this brief body, and that the stars are not above us, but within." His handwriting grew smaller, the letters fragile, as if fading into the silence he was preparing to enter. The day of departure. On June 6, 1961, a warm breeze passed over Lake Zurich. The sky was clear, a painter's blue. Jung spent the morning in his study reading quietly. Later, he looked out the window toward the garden and said softly, "Let's go back to the beginning." Those were his final words. He passed that evening in peace, surrounded by family. There was no struggle, no fear, only stillness. His breathing slowed like the tide receding. And then, like one finishing a long, beautiful dream, he simply did not wake again. After the silence. When news of his death spread, the world felt the loss of a thinker, a mystic, a scientist of the soul. But for those who had known him, it felt more like a transition, as if the man had not vanished but dissolved back into the field he had always spoken of, the collective unconscious, the invisible web of meaning connecting all life. At his funeral, no grand ceremony was held. He had requested simplicity. Friends gathered at Bollingen, by the stone tower he had built with his own hands. The lake was calm, the air bright. Birds sang in the reeds, and the sound of water lapping against the shore carried like a heartbeat. On the wall of the tower, his carving remained, a Latin phrase he had chosen years before. Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Called or not called, God will be present. That perhaps was his truest testament. Whether we seek the divine or deny it, whether we explore or ignore the depths within us, it is always there, waiting. The dream of wholeness. In the years after his death, Jung's work took on a strange afterlife. It appeared in unexpected places, in dreams, in art, in philosophy, in the collective voice of a century trying to heal itself. The world he left behind, torn by war, divided by ideology, consumed by technology, was still searching for meaning, and his message, whispered from the other side of madness, offered it, that wholeness is not perfection, but the union of opposites, that the soul is not light alone, but light embracing shadow. He once said, "Only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life." To live without contradiction was, to him, to live without truth. And so, in his final years, he taught that the goal of existence was not purity, but integration, to hold both love and terror, joy and grief, the divine and the human, without tearing them apart. That was the dream of wholeness. The root. Beneath all things, standing by the tower at Bollingen today, you can still feel it, the echo of his work in the stones. The carvings he made with his own hands bear symbols of the self, the serpent, the circle, the eternal return. It feels less like a monument and more like a living being, a mirror of the psyche in stone. Perhaps that was his intention all along, to leave behind something that would weather centuries as the human mind does. Endlessly eroding, endlessly renewing. He had once said, "The life of the individual is meaningful only if it is lived in the light of the eternal." And so he lived, between the eternal and the momentary, between the dream and the daylight world, until both became one. The eternal return. More than 60 years after his death, Jung's ideas still ripple outward. Each generation rediscovers him, in psychology, in art, in spirituality, in every human being trying to understand their dreams. He did not give answers. He gave a mirror that shows not who we are supposed to be, but who we already are. In all our contradictions, our beauty, our fear, our longing to become whole. And maybe that is why his story never truly ends. Because the work of becoming whole, the work of reconciling the light and shadow, is not Jung's alone. It is the work of every human being. The dream continues. And in that dream, the old doctor still walks by the lake, his shadow stretching long across the evening light, whispering to anyone who dares to listen, "We are the dream of the unknown, and one day we shall awaken to find we were never separate from it." As the lights fade and Jung's words echo, one question lingers. When you look within, what do you find staring back? Maybe that's where his journey truly begins. Not in the past, but for you.